Okay, looks like we're live. We're having a debate. It's debate night on superpowered broadcasting with Kevin Castley. I'm going to moderate. We've got Kevin, obviously, and he's debating Uncle Thomas. The topic is going to be China and protectionism. They're going to do some opening statements. We're shooting between 3 and 4 minutes on those. And yeah, Kevin's said that just recently he's open to doing debates on here. He's basically accepting any debate, as far as I know. And he has some stipulations. I think it has to be on his channel. Other than that, I think he's pretty much open to debating anyone.
Oh yeah, and I'll add. You also get to mirror, like Uncle Thomas gets to mirror that's on his channel too.
Yeah,
like I'm not the kind of guy to file copyright claims.
Right. Yeah, there's that too. So anyway, I guess they decided that Uncle Thomas can go first. So if you want to take it away, man.
Okay. All right. So the thing is, I'm talking in DMs a little bit with Kevin. I don't disagree with protectionism. The thing is that with China is that there's so much that is made in China. And although that is changing to a degree, I think that we still rely on China quite a bit, where they make, little batteries for like a DeWalt drill, or, getting iPhones done. I think when I was checking through my research, I wanted to say, I think 17% of Apple products, or I don't want to specify with the iPhone, but 17% are still made in China. I'm going to assume Shenzhen, because that's a fairly, that's kind of the mecca for electronics and everything else like that. So, I mean, like I say, I don't disagree with the idea of protectionism, but I think that the United States shifted long ago to a globalized economy. And so it's nice to say, oh, well, I love, protectionism and to keep American jobs, this and that. But I think it's just unrealistic. I don't want to blow, all the research that I did, but I would say is that just looking at the tariffs that we've had, there are a few industries. I was looking through the research. I didn't see specifically what industries, but approximately, now this is a wide range, but 175 to 300,000 jobs have been lost by the United States due to the tariffs that President Trump put in place. And in addition to that, there's also the tariffs themselves, which is what I was going to get at, is basically, now what I was looking at, it was 7.5% or 25% tariffs. A lot. I mean, I can't imagine which margins you're working with, depending on what industry, but that's a heck of a, just heck of a loss already up front, and that's presumably more of a fixed cost. So it's like you're already losing that much. And some companies, they're going to say they're going to stay in Vietnam, they're going to stay in Mexico, or, depending on what industry, they may go to Bangladesh or whichever else. So to me, okay, gotcha. So to me, I feel like that's definitely going to be an issue. I feel like ultimately is the idea of protectionism is nice, but there's not much to protect. And I'd say that, realizing, like, maybe I'm just, blabbering on here, but I would say is that, apart from, military procurement or, building tanks or this and that, there's a lot of spare parts around already. I mean, 5.56 ammunition or whichever the case may be, that's still going to be made in the United States, as far as I know. So I mean, but that's basically how I feel about it. Okay. But I see here that, yeah, we got the 10-second mark. I think I pretty well said my piece, but yeah.
All right. I guess he's conceding it over to you, Kevin.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Henry. And yeah, so my position on this is that when it comes to protectionism, I don't actually, I'm not here to dispute any of the statistics that Uncle Thomas actually laid out. They are basically right about where it is. I mean, that there were almost 200,000 jobs that were lost as a result of the tariffs, and that You can look at the actual tariffs in terms of their effect on the margin. I mean, they're not designed to be like, oh, it's a slight tip off the profit. No, they're designed as like a really strong deterrent against conducting business with an adversary, with communist China in this case. My position on this is as follows. It's that Uncle Thomas was right in pointing out that there's a vast degree of dependency on China at this point, on their manufacturing base. And I've talked about that on this show before, where I basically point out that, I understand why it got that way during the Cold War, that you needed to balance against the USSR, and that switching it to a 2-1 against Moscow was smarter than having it be a 2-1 against Washington. So I give credit to Nixon for that. Where I give fault is to Clinton and those that followed after him, where we should have pulled the plug on the relationship. And that's not just true for America, that's true for the UK, true for Canada. We should have all recognized that communist China was the new enemy. And if we had done so earlier on, we wouldn't have been losing as many jobs. It still would have hurt. Whereas at this point, it's going to hurt a lot. My worry is that if we don't get off the addiction soon, it's going to hurt even more down the road. And there's a concept that my friend McCarthyist, Machiavellian imperialist, talks about sometimes when he's on the show, of relative gains. And, it's a concept in IR, but the idea that, we can trade and we can gain from that, and it can be seen as a win-win, except it's a bigger win for them than it is for us, because we're enriching them on the margin more than they are lowering our cost of consumer goods and benefiting us in terms of consumer surplus. And so what that means is that we are basically generating a security problem by trading with them, and that, yes, 175,000 jobs were lost as a result of the tariffs, but in terms of transitioning away from them, that might seem like a really strong hurt in the initial phase, but in the long run, it's going to be better to get off that addiction. No addiction is painless to crack, and we need to get off of that. Otherwise, we're going to enrich them to the point that they will be able to field parity in terms of their nuclear arsenal, and they will go from being this passive building up force to trying to take over the world, and we will come into a third world war with them on a disadvantaged ground. And I'm not interested in that. And I think that these short-term hits are, in the long run, less painful than the consequences that we face down the road. So thank you.
Okay, well, I guess now we just go into open conversation. So I don't know if either of you wants to start.
Let me. There's a lot to work with here, but I would say is that you brought up that the breaking the addiction of China would be painful. Now the thing is, what I do have to say to that in response would be, okay, I'm trying to be very careful with my words so I don't just point you in bad faith. What I would say is that shifting back to building things in the United States would take, a lot of, just a lot of shaking of businessmen to say, okay, come back to the United States. And then the businessman will say, well, now you've got this $15 an hour. I'm talking about this from a purely capitalist standpoint. I'm not necessarily advocating this. I'm just saying this in a more pragmatic capitalist stance, where it's like, okay, so you've got this $15 minimum wage. And I know that's limited to maybe places like, Seattle or maybe California, this and that. Okay. So they say to themselves, okay, there's that. You also have the issue of going across different states and everything else like that, where, some states are right to work, others are union. Like I say, I know that these businesses still operate. Like Apple, they still are incorporated in the United States. I double checked on this. And, they were in Delaware, or actually it was Washington and then Delaware and then switched back to Washington. But I say to myself, okay, is it going to be that much to still save the economy? And to me, it just seems like a little bit, we don't have, to me, you would have to turn on a dime. And I guess I would say is, what time frame do you think that would be? I'll go ahead and ask that. I know that was a long rant, but yeah, basically I'll simplify it to how long would that be to transition back to more of a 1940s style sort of we can, build what we need as a country. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's a good question, because I think you and I would both agree that this would be an attainable goal over at some point of time. The question would be, how short are we going to do it over? And I think that there are really maybe three factors that really come into play here to determine the time length. And I'll mention at the end of this, my response, which one I prefer. But that the first one is a very slow transition where we have a slow awakening in Washington, where politicians realize, that China, they are going to be in the long run a problem, and that we need to slowly wean ourselves off of them, either by transferring everything over to manufacturing in other countries in the region, like India or Vietnam, etc., the Philippines, or bringing a lot of it back to the United States, or a combination thereof. By the way, I support a combination thereof. I think that non-essential goods that don't really have any essential medical or military value, I'm fine with those being made abroad. But essential stuff, I think the virus has demonstrated that you want to make those things at home, even if we're not talking about a Cold War situation. But the second timeline is where we have a government that comes into power that says, look, they're a very clear threat and we need to get off of them very soon, and we're going to bite a bullet and take a lot of damage right now. By the way, just to clarify, that first example I laid out, we're talking like 30 plus years. Like, it's a long run sort of thing. The second example, we're talking 4 to 8 years, which would be like one, kind of like tough president comes in and says, we're just going to shake down any companies and stuff, and we're going to offer, maybe a carrot approach. We'll give you subsidies to bring your stuff back here or move elsewhere in Asia, or a stick approach, or a combination thereof, where you're facing tariffs, taxes, fines, etc. The third, like I said, that one's a 4 to 8 year process. And then the third option is world war does break out with China, and then you have to move to a 1940s wartime economy, except now all your factories are over there, so you have to rebuild everything in the United States. Now that would happen immediately, but in terms of getting that production online to what it could have been if it hadn't outsourced to China, even then we're still probably talking a couple of years, even in a total war situation. So even in the most extreme case, we're talking 2 years. Now, as far as what would I prefer to see, I'd prefer to see a protectionist leader come into power and say, they're a threat. We need to view them like we did the Soviet Union. I know you guys want to make a profit, but we need to bear in mind that if you just are so greedy that you let that greed get in the way, we won't even have capitalism anymore. They'll win, and we'll have Chinese communism worldwide. So we need to get tough. And so I would advocate for a 4 to 8 year timeline. But I can predict you're probably going to say that that's extreme, and that a lot of jobs would be caught up in that, right? So, but I'll let you give your response. So.
Okay. I guess my next point would be this: is there's a lot of debate about whether, and this is something that gone on in the left, is China still socialist or even communist? That's the real question that a lot of people have, because the thing is, they've had a lot of reforms. A lot of people will say, well, they have billionaires, and that's true. I mean, look at Huawei and all this business. So, I mean, the thing is that there's a lot of folks that question this idea if China is even socialist or not. I think that, and even then, in terms of unions, there's only one union, much as the same way as, Nazi Germany. There's only one union for everybody, as far as I know. If there's someone who knows better about China, by all means, you can correct me. But that's as far as I can tell. This idea, I don't believe that China is still communist in a lot of ways. I mean, this is kind of the debate that goes back and forth. Like I say, I'm repeating myself, but basically is they have a stock market. They have a lot of the, although it's controlled and it's much more, you can't, you had to be a Chinese national, I think, to give money in and all these sorts of things. I can't remember the video that I saw from Economics Explained, but basically I don't really get this idea. It's like, under the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, a lot of folks are mad about that. And of course, then you can get into the Uyghur issue and all that. That's more of a delicate sort of feature. I'm not going to really get into, I don't really want to touch that. What I would say though is I just don't believe that they are fully communist at all, or even socialist. I think in some ways, as they say, it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. And so, yeah, I guess my question to you is, as back there, like I said, sometimes I get to ramble. I'm a bit of a boomer, but I would say this as a question is,
Hey man, I'm a boomer too, dude.
right, okay.
Boomerisms are welcome here, man.
All right, I appreciate that. I was going to say is, okay, my question would be is, how would you give me, I'll try to make it simple, 3 points that you would say that China is still socialist, I guess. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I guess before I get to those 3 points, I just want to briefly talk a little bit about how they could still be qualified as communists. Because when I say communists, I'm more talking about their guiding ideology. I don't mean to say that they're literally communists right now. They're as communist as the Soviet Union was. In other words, they're communists that understand that in order to achieve communism, you have to have this sort of vanguard party that builds the material conditions out of the agrarian system. Obviously, they have a more Maoist, peasant-centered focus on that than the Soviets did. But this idea that you can't just go from a feudal agrarian system over to communism, that there has to be this transition to the material conditions of capitalism. The reason why they're ultimately communist, though, is for the same reason that Lenin was communist, even though Lenin implemented the new economic plan, when the NEP, but back in the early 1920s, where he basically looked at the situation and said, look, we need to and by the way, just for everybody who's tuning in right now, I'm not a communist or anything. I'm just kind of outlaying like their sort of perspective as I see it. He basically said, look, we are in an agrarian backwater. We need to set up the material conditions to assist socialism. So we're going to have kind of a laissez-faire approach to things. Even Lenin did this. And so where I see China is like a longer term institution of what the NEP was in Russia. The NEP was a lot shorter lived in Russia, and Stalin put an end to it. China was a little bit different. They went really hardcore in almost the Stalinist type direction early on, and then they did their sort of NEP sort of thing later on under Deng Xiaoping, whereas in Lenin, he did it kind of right away, and then they moved into a more authoritarian socialist system. So in the sense of, I guess this would be the first point to why they're sort of communist or socialist, which is that in terms of their guiding ideology, they see themselves and their purpose in everything that they do to establish the material conditions under the leadership of the party to transition towards communism. And so that is their goal in that sense. And so so they aspire to communism. The second point on the socialist aspect of it is that, well, they might seem capitalist in terms of their edifice, in terms of some of the qualities of them, that they have the billionaires, as you point out, like Jack Ma, for example, and we'll talk about him a little bit. Like Jack Ma, we can also look at, they look at their skyscrapers and stuff. The Soviet Union didn't have that. They look kind of like New York, except with even more lights in some areas. The problem is it's all government run. It's all state controlled. And even if you've got a free enterprise sort of thing, if they get anywhere near big enough to influence anything, they're under the heel of the party. And there's no private property in the true sense of the term, because unlike here, you have to pay your property taxes. Over there, even if you do all that and you pay off your mortgage and everything, you're still just leasing stuff for less than a century from the party. There is no intergenerational wealth building in that sense. It's all still the ownership of the party. And the third aspect as to how they're socialist is look at their authoritarian system. Look at how they have a total management over the society in terms of the party. I mean, even the army, the People's Liberation Army and their associated branches, they don't serve the Chinese people. They don't serve the nation. They don't serve the geography. They serve the Communist Party. So in terms of its political structure, they are deeply intrinsically socialist, aiming to build communism. So that's why I call them communists. But I guess a more accurate descriptor or title would be socialist China with communist aspirations. So that's my perspective. But what do you think of that? Okay.
I can't really disagree with most of your points. I would say this kind of as maybe as a straw man, but I think it's important to say is that recently the EU made a deal with China. Now I was looking at the details of it, but basically it's just let me make sure here. I'm just going to look through my file here a little bit. This is a Financial Times report. I'll go ahead and be good faith here. I'll go ahead and let you I'll put this in the private chat. That way you can see it.
Okay.
Just so I'm good faith here. I'm trying to be. I'm not just trying
I can post this to the chat too, so that people can read it as well.
That's the Financial Times article. So you can let me just look through this quick here. I'll just make sure.
I'll just post that in the public chat.
Okay.
There we go. So people can see it as well.
Okay. Other parts of the agreement seek to ensure transparency of subsidies. Beijing, the deal will lock in existing market access rights while securing some openings in the areas of manufacturing and renewable energy. I know that. China is trying to. They're much more. They have the self-driving cars. They have much, and have really embraced solar panels and solar, I should say. And the United States, we do have it, but it's not. It's just kind of so. It's kind of in between there. As far as I know, I'm not an expert on that, but I would say is okay. New U.S. administration. Yeah, I think that is a concern though as well. Is that obviously Biden wanted to come in and say, yeah, we want to rebuild ties with World Health Organization and the EU and our European. I'm going to say compatriots, but I know he probably didn't use it. So this puts a little, this definitely puts a little bit of mud thrown at Joe Biden and his administration to say, okay, what can we do now? And to me, I'll put it this way: is it a certain way? It kind of sets up everything where you have China working with not only the EU now. They also have bullet trains being entered into Israel. And so this is from 2019. I'll go ahead. This is from Jerusalem Post. So I'll go ahead and drop that in as well, just so y'all can see that. But yeah, so we have Israel, someone who is considered one of our biggest allies, is working with China. To me, that would be, like I say, I'm not going to say I don't agree with Israel, and we're not going. And that's not the debate. So we're not going to go into that.
We can debate about Israel another time.
Well, yeah. But yeah, I'm just saying is that our greatest, you know what? What I was going to say, but I'm not going to do. But basically, is a very valuable part.
Ally.
Yeah. I was trying to be careful. I didn't want to just meme it out and everything else like that. I do have some filter there, but anyway. So with that, we can see that even Israel is working with China. As far as I know, it's just with the trains. As far as I know, it's not with other aspects, but still. And of course, there's also the issue with Iran. They're talking about working with Iran. Obviously, Iran's like, hey, you're working with Israel. How come you're trying to make a deal with us too? Now, like I say, I use that as a point to say, okay, well, China has made these allies. And you can say, and I can agree with your point that, yes, they are still a, socialism with Chinese characteristics, as they say. But I would say that they have made fairly powerful allies. Same thing with African nations. Recently, of course, with the, before the death of Robert Mugabe, you had Zimbabwe. And of course, like I say, everyone was saying, well, the Chinese set this up. And who knows? I'm not going to sit here and do that. But China has been able to use its soft power quite a bit. The same thing, even, I like to do martial arts and whatnot. And I studied Chinese martial arts. So there's my bias right there a little bit. But wushu is a huge amount of soft power. And you'll see Russians, you'll see Iranians, you'll see folks from Singapore, you'll see folks from Japan and doing various martial arts, not just wushu, which is much more flashy and was much more created by the Chinese Communist Party with a lot of fancy stuff, but also arts like Chin style Tai Chi, which is much more of a traditional martial art. It has been, they include these things called nandu, which are these difficult moves. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm just ranting. I'm just talking at this point, but it set things apart. And I would say is that, do you think that these deals with China are going to be a hamper to, the rest of the world? It seems like obviously Australia is also having a lot of issues with China. I think that there was a big thing where basically China said, we're not going to do trade with I can't remember the list of of items offhand. I can't think of off the top of my head, but I would say is that they're having difficulty with Australia. And of course, China's already has a fair amount of power in Australia in other ways. So, I mean, it just seems like, trying to create a bulwark is going to be hard when you have all these other countries making deals with China. That's my take, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, I want to say, actually, I appreciate you pointing out all those areas of Chinese entanglement in the world, because it kind of, in that sense, makes an argument. At least I'll say this. In my view, it makes an argument for my side, which is American exceptionalism and unilateralism. Because I've said before, like, unilateralism in the face of feckless allies is no vice; it's a virtue. Because the EU, I mean, on my show, we make fun of the EU all the time. I'm not a supporter of the EU. I think that the EU needs to either be dissolved and replaced, or just outright dissolved, and America and the Anglosphere dominate Europe. That's my sort of approach to it. But what I think about China in terms of their soft power, they're far better at exercising soft power than the Soviets were. And I think part of the reason why is that they're just far better at harnessing what you might say the mechanisms of capitalism than the Soviets were. And China's a lot better at ingratiating themselves to the world economy, despite ultimately seeking to usurp it in the long run. Now, they've got a very long-term vision. They're not talking about 4 or 8 years. We're talking like 50 plus years here. But that what this ultimately demonstrates to me is that we've allowed this addiction to fester. We've allowed this to get really bad. And if we allow this to continue, we can extrapolate from that it's going to get a lot worse. And the European Union definitely needs to be scolded over this. I think that them reaching out to communist China is definitely a slap in the face to America, who by and large offers her umbrella, especially in nuclear regard to. And so it's a betrayal in that sense. As far as it relates to Israel, and again, this could be a topic for a different debate, but just to briefly touch on it, this might be a little bit controversial, because I've actually defended Israel reaching out to Russia and China. The reason why they do it is because they hedge their bets, because they know that sometimes America will have a leader like Obama that doesn't have their back. And so if you're the leader of Israel and you know that there might be some leader like Obama who's going to think of you as like this apartheid state or whatever, you do need to have a backup plan. Otherwise, you'll be buried. And so they're in a really tough spot. So you can call that dictator apologetics or whatever. Like, I don't like Putin, I don't like Xi, but I just wish that America and the West were far better allies to Israel in that sense, because Israel has been an excellent ally to us, and they're a bastion of freedom in the region, the beacon on the hill, etc. But we don't need to get in that right now. But I know, but I'm trying to do debates at least every week, so we could do the debate on that down the road. But the thing is, I would say, I don't remember exactly everything that you posed in that question, but I do have a question for you though, Thomas, which is that, I pointed out the ways that I thought that communist China or socialist China meets the criteria that would be characterizing socialism. But my question to you would be, let's say that they weren't socialist. Let's just say that in no way could you reasonably call them communist or socialist. My question would be, would you still characterize them as a rival? And would you still describe the relationship or the configuration in the world system right now as a Cold War? Because I do, and I view them as a rival regardless of their ideology. But what do you think about that?
Well, I'll be honest. As an American, I while I do have my sympathies for China, I'll put it that way. I do have my biases and say that, but ultimately I'm not Chinese. I'm never going to be Chinese. So and I'm not going to go too big on that, but I will just say is that, so I am an American. So I do see it as a Cold War, but I feel like this idea where I'm trying to be very careful with my words, so that way I don't mistake things. But I would say that I guess I would say that yes, we are in an issue of a Cold War, but I would say that it's something that you say that it was an addiction and something like that. But I would say that this is just capitalism, period. I think that this is just something, and obviously this isn't about capitalism specifically, so I'm going to try to be careful with that. But I would say is that, there are plenty of connections that occur, that basically, like I said, it's great deals, this and that. I mean, yeah, you can still have that when you go to, or you could have something similar in India or Bangladesh or wherever you produce. But I think that I'm going to try to answer your question. I'm just trying to be I'm just seeing how I can formulate it properly. But I guess I would say is that, yes, we are in a Cold War, and yes, we should see them as a threat. But I think that it would be better to play kind of I guess I would just say to kind of, if we're going to have that sort of issue, we have to be able to get some things done domestically first. And I would say, I know people are going to laugh and say, "Oh, Lord, have mercy, this guy." But I guess I would say,
well, my advice would be probably, because this helped me before. Best advice I ever had in debates and stuff: just don't read the chat. So,
I'm not reading. Oh no, I'm not reading the chat. No,
okay, because it can be distracting, right?
So. No, yeah. Oh no, I'm not going to do that. What I will say is that I don't want to be just a contrarian and just be like, well, we should support China and everything else like that. But I guess I would say is, try to build up allies. But I think that, like I say, we are given the army that we have. And I guess, like I say, you can see Australia, and Australia is a fairly kind of so-so partner, I guess you could say. We can, get into that a little bit maybe. But I guess I would say is that we have led ourselves this way because we chose to get involved. Once Nixon came in and talked with Mao Zedong, and after Deng Xiaoping came in and had the reforms and helped to create a city like Shenzhen, which was nothing. It was just just kind of a fishing village, much in the same way as Hong Kong. Now it's pretty much the center of, arguably the center of the universe of electronics, where these things are being made. So I feel like, it is a difficult pickle, but I think that the United States has a lot of issues. The same thing. I'll bring it to you. I'll bring this to you because I think it's an interesting point. Obviously, recently, Eric Swalwell, with his relationship with Christine Fang, aka Fang Fang, and the two mayors, these two Midwestern mayors that she slept with, and nothing happens to him, as far as I know anyway. Is that 2015 apparently he said he cut off ties when agents came to him and said, you need to do something about this. Now here we are 5 years later, and we're wondering, well, how much did we give away? So it's like we've taken the L already, and I feel like we're already on the back foot. So if if we were in a Cold War, it's like, well, it's a different circumstance. I would say this is not the same thing as McCarthyist, McCarthyist United States, where we're going to be searching people and everything else like that. We're going to be, all this sort of thing. We want to. It's one of those contradictions where we want to be able to have this globalized economy, but we also want to be able to keep things protected. And it's the fine balance. I think that was kind of my point. It's kind of backwards, but go ahead.
Well, yeah, I guess just to kind of follow up on that. So you did say that you could kind of characterize it as being in a Cold War state. And you also said that it would make sense for America to view China as a threat. But then you also mentioned how some of these developments in China have been, very good for China. I don't disagree with you talking about that kind of stuff as taking an L. Like over here on my channel, what we do all the time is we call it the European Union, we call it weak leaders in America and Canada, etc., for just being really soft on China. I call it Trudeau all the time, for example. Like, you're right that we've taken L's. My kind of mission is to change the culture so we start taking W's. But I mean, you're absolutely like correct to say, yeah, they've been taking W's for a large part, and we've been letting them get away with it. I though, the point where I draw a line, though, is I would say for me personally, I'm still a patriot. I'm still on this side. I'm still on the side of the West. I want to try to find solutions so that we can start winning. Whereas a lot of people, they just say, oh, well, China's winning, I'm going to go inside with them. And it's like, yeah, but the Soviets were winning in the early Cold War in space, yet America still won. My hope would be, with everything that's happened, that this would kind of serve as, an analogous Sputnik moment where we do say, we're done. Like, we're not going to tolerate spies. We're not going to tolerate sedition. We're not going to tolerate them infiltrating our realty and Hollywood, etc., all that kind of stuff. We're going to get serious on the communist infiltration of the West. I mean, you talk about Australia. Australia is really saturated in Chinese influence right now. So is Canada, and it's getting dangerous. Is my sort of view of it. But I guess it's not just about communism, because they could have a different ideology. I guess the thing for me is that at the end of the day, the ideology is almost irrelevant. I mean, maybe if their ideology was liberal democracy and America's was liberal democracy, maybe then they could get along, though I would still say their huge ambitions and their huge military would still probably bring them into conflict. But given that they are opposing ideologies, I see it as, regardless of what their ideology is, they're a rival, they're Han Chinese chauvinists, and they want to basically swindle the world as I see it. But I guess my sort of question to you, Thomas, would be, do you think that the West is, I guess, a lost cause in this sense? Because you mentioned that the West has been taking L's, or do you think that the West can win this, or do you basically see this as an inevitable win for China in the end?
I think I would just say right now, I think that it's kind of mixed. I would say right now, I see that China is winning, and we already discussed that. I would say it's somewhere in the middle. Is it right now? I think that the United States domestically, and I know that I've heard a little bit when you were talking with McCarthyists and all that, saying that basically foreign policy and we're going to be worried about that. So I understand that's kind of the mindset that y'all have. What I would say though is and beyond the whole Black Lives Matter stuff, is that we've seen Seattle pretty much just shut down, and people have been moving there, leaving. And this is just one example. I'm just using this as as just an anecdote. But
okay.
We see that with the United States is that we're not really united, and is that whatever Joe Biden may promise or what he may or may not do is really kind of up in the air, right? And so, and I mean, a lot of people are saying is that ultimately Joe Biden is going to leave, and it's going to be Kamala Harris as the first president, so we can have the yes queen and all that business. But anyway, beyond that, though, is the issue of where we are in the times. Now, I remember I was watching CGTN a little bit, and they were doing a, kind of talking about, and they had a Westerner on there. I think he's probably an American who was a visiting teacher. I forget where. Could be Beijing University or Peking University. I'm not sure. But anyway, talking about the history of white supremacy in America and all this. And I think that it kind of, regardless is that they have picked up on this propaganda. I think China has a fairly strong propaganda that works. And there are, Westerners who are over there being able to promote that. The Soviet Union didn't have that to the same degree. I mean, they and I mean, even the DPRK, we had people like Joe Dresnok, who even I can agree with. It was a scumbag. I think even I have to say is that while I can,
we agree there. We agree.
Yeah. I agree that Joe Dresnok was, and I say that just as an off point because, like I say, the DPRK to me, they just want to unify with Korea. That's the whole thing. Now, you're not going to agree with that. That's fine. Okay.
Wait, no, I think we agree. That's a huge. Wait, hold on a second.
Okay,
that's
go ahead.
A huge point of agreement. That's surprising because a lot of people that I will debate or that I've argued with on Twitter, etc., DPRK apologists and stuff, they'll say, well, no, Kim only wants the nukes. Kim's only interested in his own sovereignty. He doesn't want to take over the South. That's imperialist propaganda and stuff. But you're saying right here, they do want to have reunification with the South because that's what I warn about.
That's my opinion. Now this is what I've seen. I've tried to look in on different channels. I can't think of the names of channels offhand on YouTube, but basically, they were on the route to making some ties, and obviously there are still folks that go back and forth between South Korea and North. relatives that they're visiting. I can't remember if it's once a year or something like that, but they go back and forth. And to me, that's still a heartbreaking thing to see that these folks cannot visit their family in the north. And obviously, to me, this is more of where I say this is, we should pull troops out of Panmunjom and at least make some sort of gains. And I know we're going off topic. I'll try to steer myself back on China, but I think it's important because obviously China and the DPRK are some of the biggest allies. And to me, I think it was just this leaflet program. There were some South Korean leaflets that fell through, and the DPRK leaders considered them very, very bad and everything else like that. And so the wall went back up, so to speak, in terms of trying to make trade. But I mean, that's my view of it. I'm sorry to go off on a tangent like that, but I thought of Joe Dresnock and then I just went down the list. But I think that getting back onto it is China has fairly sophisticated propaganda. And I think they have a lot. It's like when you see CGTN or when you see New China, and of course these channels will be in English, and they have their presenters are speaking British and all that, are very fairly high end, and they have these fairly high end British accents and everything. So we see that they it is better than CNN in some cases. So I think that just adds to the level of it. And I was going to shoehorn this in somewhere because I knew somewhere this was going to come, but I'll go ahead and mention it here. Is that I mentioned it. I want to make sure with the question. You believe that China created the coronavirus, right?
Oh, no. Okay. No, I don't believe that the Chinese government did. I think it was inevitable consequence of their sanitary lack of practice and the government cover-up that exacerbated it.
Okay. I just want to make sure on that point, because I was going to say, is it something I think that another point that we can agree on, just so we can create a little better rapport, is the amount of the racism that occurred here in the United States towards Asians. There have been Asians that were being beaten up because they said, well, you created the coronavirus, China, the China virus and Corona chain and all that, So we saw that. And to me, this sets a bad precedent where, we may have a Cold War, but it's not, when you see, it's obviously a different time with social media. When you see these videos of folks getting beaten up, you're like, it just, furthermore, in terms of the winning hearts and minds, like in the Vietnam War, you're like, ooh, that's just me.
I'm
not saying you agree with that. I'm just saying that is another aspect. Go ahead.
I got to get my point in there though, just on that one, which is that just like in the old Cold War, let's take the space race as an example, but whereas in the space race, both the Soviet Union and America had their successes and the failures, yet the world only saw the Soviet successes and the world saw America's failures and America's successes, because when they would send up, say, the Redstone rocket and test it and see if they could actually send an animal into space or whatever, what happened? Well, all the crews are gathered around at Cape Canaveral and they're all ready to go to watch this. It's like, what is it, like 1956 or whatever? And guess what? It explodes on the launch pad. Embarrassment everywhere. People think America's a joke. Whereas the Soviets, they had a lot of those failures too. They never reported them. They were at secret military sites. And then when they had their success and they did send up an animal into space, guess what? They're like, oh, we just did it. And you don't know how many failures they had. Likewise, in this case, likewise in the new Cold War, they control their media. They control what gets out of the country. We don't. The world can see us. So they see our faults and our successes. We only see what they want us to see. As far as the racism goes, you can talk about those specific instances within America, and it looks bad, and you could say that hurts the image of America. It gives the CCP this sort of victimization complex. Here's what we don't see, though: the 1.5 million Uyghurs that are detained, beaten, starved, etc., that are rounded up so that their culture can be basically driven out of them, and they can be, amalgamated by force into this chauvinistic Han Chinese hegemony. We don't really see that. We can see the satellite imagery, but they don't really broadcast that out to the world. And so that's why when we're in a Cold War with a closed society versus an open society, you're going to see more embarrassing things from the open society, even if far worse things happen in closed society, because they are a closed society. So that's my not defense of what happened, but that it pales in comparison to the racial discrimination against non-Han Chinese in communist China. So
okay. Let me mention this just for a moment, and then we will move on to the Uyghurs, because obviously it was an inevitability that we were going to discuss it with China. I would say that with China and the United States, we have to be careful because of the yellow peril. And now, obviously, that comes from the Qing dynasty and everything else, and the idea that the Chinese are cooking up cats and dogs, and like I said, that goes further into that. A lot of that stereotype still exists. There's a lot of video that goes on. I don't want to discuss that in depth, but I'm just saying is that there's a history of that, when yellow peril and bring up this idea in the Exclusion Act and everything else like that. So there's a deeper story with that. With the Uyghurs, in my opinion, the difference is that the Uyghurs, there was obviously the knife attacks that occurred. I think it was 10 that were killed, I want to say. There's also been some attacks, and I know it's been, it's been maybe 10 years since that occurred. But I think that the Chinese, I'm not going to sit here and defend. What I will say, though, is that from a Chinese standpoint, they don't want any sort of separatist movement, because they've had, post Qing dynasty, when, I'm stepping into deeper waters here, but I'm going to try to stay within reason here. But the Qing dynasty, you had, the Xinhai Rebellion, you had a lot of different groups, particularly, groups like the Ma clique, where they set up their own government, who also, they went to work with the Kuomintang. You had the Christian movement that occurred in China, where the leader basically says that he is reincarnation of Jesus, and so there's this history of saying that Chinese are afraid of that sort of rebellion. And I would also say is that with the Uyghurs as well, is that the thing is that you can't just say, well, the Chinese hate Muslims, because the thing is that there are at least, I remember seeing this from like a Marxist-Leninist Maoist blog, but I think it's 11 different Muslim minorities in China alone. And particularly the one I point at, I talked about the Ma clique just for a minute, but you had the Wei Muslims. And obviously the Uyghurs also have beef with the Wei Muslims. This goes back, a fair amount of time, because I think they were dealing drugs or something like that back and forth. So this is a much more complicated issue than that. You also have beef with, I think, Tibetans as well. Now, this goes back centuries as well between them. So like I say, I'm not going to sit here and defend that, but also on a more realistic note, I'm going all over the place, but I'm trying to stay to a point here. Also with the Uyghurs is that you have about, I think the numbers are roughly around 20,000 Uyghurs who have later joined like the East Turkestan Army, this and that, who are, at least a few are still in Idlib right now, who are, I imagine some are affiliated with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And of course, that is controlled by Turkey and Erdogan. Now, I know that you said is that you think that Turkey is going down a bad path. That's a whole other, that's another potential debate that we could have between what actually, what's the relationship between Turkey and Russia. But that's,
yeah.
Thing is that
on that debate, tomorrow night, I'm going to be debating McCarthyist on Turkey, because he argues that Turkey is still a net asset to America. I'm going to argue
really?
net negative. So we're already going to have a similar debate. It's just the difference, I think, is that he and I are both from a really kind of like, he's not a neocon, but we're both from a really hawkish pro-US side. So in that sense, whereas, if I were to describe like your sort of politics, or like where you sort of come from, or you can describe it yourself, but you probably would not identify as a neocon, right?
No. Like I say, I mean, I would say this point, and I'm just going to, I'm not going to, I'll just save my time for what I would type in the chat, is that you would probably say that somehow, just a brief outline, we don't have to go over about in depth, but I would say this is that I don't really get this idea that you said that Russia and Turkey are working together or are allied because they have missiles. And I'm like, okay, well, they're opposed in Syria, They're opposed in Nagorno-Karabakh, in that region. Not in Libya, as far as I know. There's not that much information, but it's like, okay.
Well, no, actually, they kind of are in a way opposed in Libya, but it's a little bit more complicated. But that would be an argument in your favor, though.
Yeah,
Libya. So
that's all. That's all I was going to mention on that, because I heard you say that, and I'm like, I mean, okay, they had the S-300 missiles. It's like, okay, yeah, they got those missiles, but it's like in other terms, though. But like I said, that's a whole other issue. But we can move on from that. But yeah, that's the issue with the Uyghurs as well. I want to mention one last thing, and then we can. I
just want to stop you on the Uyghur thing quickly. Though that's kind of like if a country like the United States, though, just persecuted, like, I don't know, let's say everybody who was Saudi Arabian, because like a few people that were the 9/11 hijackers were Al-Qaeda people that were kicked out of Saudi Arabia and exiled, but they just happen to ethnically be Saudi or whatever. It's kind of the same situation there, where it's like you're ethnically cleansing, you're punishing 1.5 million people to force your culture down their throats. Yet the excuse that's offered is that less than 2% of them are associated with basically like what would be basically considered a rival army. It's like, okay, I think that at the end of the day, I'm going to say it is basically, in essence, it's sanitizing the extent of the persecution that's being done there. And yes, they do have token minority groups too. So does North Korea. I mean, there are Christians in North Korea. There's a Christian church in North Korea. Does that mean that you are free to be Christian in North Korea? No, because if you go in there and try to proselytize in the name of Christ, you're going to be taken to a gulag, right? That's what happens. So, it's all controlled by the party. It's just this facade. It's a Potemkin village in that sense. But that's my view.
Yeah. What was I going to talk about with the Uyghurs? There was another slight point I was going to bring. I can't think of it offhand. I think what I was going to say with that, though, is there's the idea that basically they are being turned into Han. I think that they are being. I don't really believe fully that they are being forced to drink alcohol, this and that. And I think a lot of the thing is, and that this is something that goes on with the left as well. This is something that Caleb Maupin and all those goobers are fighting about right now, between the serfs and all that other, the bread tube folks versus the MLs, is that you have the fight between, okay, do we take people like Adrienz seriously? I didn't mean to say Aryan, excuse me, but Adrienz seriously. And then they'll point to someone like Drew Gladney, who also, is part, I think he supports the East Turkestan movement as well, I think. So I'm like, the folks that really advocate and really push for the Uyghur idea are not, they are not completely, transparent. In some ways, they are colluding with these movements. Now, I just say that as a point. I'm not going to sit here and disagree with what goes on with the Uyghurs and all this, but the people who promote the idea to the United States and to the rest of the world, or at least to the Western world, I'll put it that way. People like Drew Gladney or Adrienz, they're on shaky ground. That's how I feel. I forget what my other point was, but that's the point I'm going to make about the Uyghurs in further. But go ahead.
Well, when you say shaky ground, can you just clarify exactly what you mean there? Like, you're basically saying like they have ulterior motives for highlighting this, but is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah. With Adrienz, is a big thing that they have promoted is, of course, that a lot of they'll say that his research may be good, and some people say his research is trash. But furthermore, is that his ulterior motive is that he's an evangelical Christian. And this is I can't fully understand why he would be this way and whatnot, but I think that's with the aspect of Adrienz. And basically they're like, no, this guy's a crazy right-wing evangelical. He's a nutcase. We're not going to deal with him, this and that. I think that he was, maybe I'm getting it wrong. I think he was one of the guys that was crying on TV, I think, or there was like a press conference, I think. I'm sure the chat can correct me, or somebody will. But I'm like, like I say, there's a lot of debate about who brings this information in. And I think that's one of the things is that, okay, who is actually broadcasting this information versus, are we getting, where are the sources for this information? I guess that's what I'm saying is, okay. But yeah, I don't know where the hell I was going with that, but go ahead. That's where I stand.
Okay, yeah, I guess on that point, I mean, you can say, well, maybe he's a right-wing evangelical Christian. It's like, so was George W. Bush. He was still right about Saddam and his atrocities. Like, I'd rather be an evangelical Christian than a communist myself. And I would side with an evangelical Christian against the CCP any day. That's me. I would stand in solidarity with them. I think on the point about the Uyghurs, though, you did mention that obviously the CCP views them as a threat because of these incidents of what would objectively be considered insurrection by any country's standards. Here's the thing from my perspective, though, which is that in the broad scheme of what's happening to the masses of people, it's an atrocity. But as far as those particular Uyghurs that have opposed the CCP and have been violent, I actually support them. I support them for the same reason that I would have supported those uprising in Hungary or those in Czech Republic or the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Like I want to destroy the CCP, so they're my allies in that sense. So
okay, the thing is that you say that, and what I would say is that this makes them, dare I say, I'm gonna try to be. This may be the edge where I go into some bad faith, but I'm going to try to be careful here. But what I would say is there's a brief video that came out with I think it was an ex-CIA officer who was like, that's why we support the Uyghurs, so that we can, have an insurrection. There are 20,000 Uyghurs are with, Erdogan right now. I'm just doing a rubbish Southern accent, but it's like, and he was saying basically is that we're going to use the Uyghurs to help break up China. And that's why he said that's why we're never going to leave Afghanistan. That's just a side note, but it's like there was that brief video, and it has gone around, in at least in the circles that I run in, and that just kind of points back to your view. But I would say that this kind of shows them that they are pawns, and I don't want to view people as that way. Is it? And I'm going to try to be careful here, but it just seems like you're that people don't actually care about the Uyghurs. They just want them for means to an end. Similar to, dare I say it, but I would say similar to the Kurds, whether that be in Iraq in 1991 when we said, hey, rebel against Saddam, keep rebelling. And then, of course, they were gassed and everything else. And, same thing with the Shias as well in Iraq. Of course, we saw with Rojava as well. It's just, it's like, do people actually care about them, or are they just pawns for a means to an end used as a chess move to something else? Not that we, but yeah, that's how I see it.
Well, to kind of answer that question, you get at a point there, which I think there's some area of agreement between us, which is that I am also critical of George H.W. Bush for, not actually standing up for the Kurds. If you say that the Kurds were basically used as a pawn in that sense to almost justify kicking him out of Kuwait, but then not actually do anything to then help the Kurds, that's basically true. I mean, I'm not a fan of George H.W. Bush. I mean, he didn't do anything. I mean, his son wound up finishing the job. But if I was George H.W. Bush, I would have been like, oh, I'm not scared of the Russians. He was scared of the Russians. I would have taken out Saddam. I think your point on, you also mentioned, for example, the Uyghurs. Now, the Uyghurs, it's a little bit more complicated because you could say, well, are they a pawn in this? It's like, look, I'll be straight up. Yes, there's a geopolitical interest for the United States to stand with them apart from any human rights angle. But it's not simply just, oh, they're a pawn or whatever, because the United States is on the side of human rights. So when the United States, even without caring about human rights, acts in her interest, human rights around the world are benefited, because if America wins the world, we have global human rights, whereas if China wins the world, we don't. And so I can see where you're coming from in terms of like that you basically find it a very cynical view to see peoples basically be caught up in the fray. But the international system, almost by definition, is always going to have smaller, lesser powers and great powers and superpowers, and lesser powers will be caught up in the fray between superpowers, and that we have to pick a superpower, and we also cannot be so virtue signaling that we are unafraid to get our hands dirty. Otherwise, our enemies will seize upon that advantage, and they will get their hands dirty, and they will bury us in the dirt. So that's my sort of stance on that. But I'll go to you for any sort of follow up there.
Okay. So I had to cringe for a minute, and like I said, we're just trying to be careful here. But with the issue of when I hear that the United States is a home of human rights, it's like I'm an American myself, and while I have my loyalties because as I like to say, I'm a product of the United States. So I don't think I'm going to go somewhere here and try to promote something else. I'm an American through and through. But I would say this idea that the United States is a home of human rights, we got to be careful with that. The reason I say that is because this is like a comment that I gave to you in your comments when I said about, I think you were talking about Vosh, but I think you were talking about the agreement between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. IBM was involved with the Holocaust. We have the My Lai massacre. We have, and these are just a few, and of course, then we can get into Abu Ghraib as well. So when I hear that America is the home of human rights, it's like let's dial that down a little bit, because it's like we're no angels. Are we slightly better than other places? Maybe, but it's like let's not promote this idea where it's like we're like the United States are perfect angels. No, we have plenty of skeletons and we have blood on our hands, just like any other. And you could say the same thing. Now I know you'll definitely disagree with this, but same thing with Gaddafi, where we have Hillary Clinton saying, we came, we saw him, he died, and everything else, and he was sodomized by a bayonet. Now you can feel as you want to. I'm not going to sit here and once again.
That was based.
No, once again, the country of Libya is now in a civil war, where Erdogan is now going to
improvement over a slave plantation for 40 years. Better to be in chaos than
there's slavery now, though. That's the whole thing. There's slavery now in
there are some. I did a video on this that open slave markets. The whole country used to be a slave plantation. I'll take slave markets over a plantation. So it's an improvement. You're right. You're right. It's not perfect. Definitely not perfect. They didn't nation build. I'm critical of Obama. I would have stayed there 30 years.
Okay. All right. I guess what I would say then would be the same thing with, like, for example, the Iraq War, and this is we'll get back onto China in just a moment. I'll try and be good faith here, but I think that I just want to at least address some of the things I had.
No, I think we should we're just over the hour mark. I think we should have an intermission though.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say we just went over an hour. I have one question. I think for Uncle Thomas.
Sure.
I know where obviously I'm familiar with Kevin. I know where he's coming from. He's a neocon. I'm not sure. What's your political perspective? Like, do you have a label, or are you just kind of a?
I guess for right now, I guess I would unironically call myself somewhat of a national Bolshevik, a Nazbol, if you will. I know that's a mean term in general, but I would say more realistically, I guess I would call myself somewhat of a socialist, I guess you could say, in some terms.
So you're like a right-wing socialist, sort of?
I guess we'll go ahead and say yes, but not the national type. We'll go ahead and put it that way.
Well, yeah, I wasn't going to call you a national.
Right, I appreciate it. I just wanted to make sure.
I was saying, like, you domestically, you have like some socially conservative views,
yes,
but economically more socialist views.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting. It's a unique perspective. It was hard to pin you down because I was like hearing you say certain things. I'm like, I'm not sure. At one point, I thought you were a libertarian, but then I was like, well, no, he's like going for more socialist stuff. But no, that was just my curiosity, man.
Yeah, I don't care for libertarians in that way. I haven't studied libertarianism that much, but I'll kind of go ahead and explain just briefly, just kind of my political background, and then we'll go to that intermission.
Well, I think we both also agree, though. I think we both also agree that we're not really fans of libertarians. So that's the thing. I think this channel is probably the only place you'll see on YouTube a neocon and a Nazbol debate. So there is that.
There is that, yeah. And I would say that I think that we've been I've tried to be good faith. There are some things I disagree with, but now that
no. For Nazbol versus a neocon, this is probably the most sort of polite debate you'll ever find. For that amount of disagreement, Yeah.
Well, I'm a bit older, and I'll go ahead and just, like I say, I'll try to stick on point. But I used to be more of a Daily Show liberal, as I will call it, which is more like, okay, Jon Stewart and all that business, dabbing on George W. Bush and all that business. And then in the later years, I kind of got tired of it, and I was just sort of in between, I guess you would say, politically. And then, I worked a job being an HVAC. I was a technician. So in the van all the time, they had, Rush Limbaugh, they had, Sean Hannity, what's his name? Glenn Beck. And I think really, ironically, it kind of started with Glenn Beck in a certain way where I kind of vaguely called myself conservative. And then once he got to, the issue of the 2016 election, and, where Glenn Beck and his guys were, and I was hearing this on the radio, but I guess there's film of it. He stuck his face in the cheese. And I was like, okay, no, I'm done with you, corny. No, you guys are corny. I'm done with this crap. And then from there, I was just kind of, I guess I was somewhat, I'm going to be very careful with my terms, but I guess we'll say Whig-nat-ish. And we'll just be careful with that term. But I get somewhat in there, and now I'm more Nosbol-esque and much more, I guess, socialist-esque. I guess.
Yeah, I think I got you. Like you're, socially conservative, but economically more open to socialist type policies.
Right. Yeah, that's about it. So 5 minutes.
Yeah, take a break real quick.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll be right back.
We'll be back soon, folks. And then Uncle Thomas is going to ask me something about the Iraq War. So that'll be interesting. Again, you're watching Superpower Broadcasting. I'm pretty sure this is like the only show on the internet where a neocon and a Nazbol will ever go head to head. So that's, worth subscribing to. So I'll be back in a minute.
All right.
Well, I'm back. I see Kevin's there.
Yeah, I'm here. Just give me a moment there.
Okay.
All right, you good.
Set up. Okay. All right. Okay, ready.
All right. I don't remember exactly where you guys had left off. I think you were trying to get back to China and protectionism. I think you were talking about the Iraq War and things like that, which you can talk about if you want. But
okay, we'll just briefly touch on that, and then we'll continue. We'll see if we can find our way back on the Belt and Road back to China. We'll see if we can do that. I guess my question would be about Iraq. Would be I'll go ahead and simplify it into one question, then we'll find our way back, which is, do you think that the Iraq War made it safer after the death of, or finding Saddam and then having him hung? Do you think that it's safer now, or was it safer before? I'll get
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I can answer that, because in any case where we're talking about an intervention in the country, you're talking about two different facets. You're talking about safer for the region and then safer for the domestic people that are there. So in both regards, I would say absolutely yes. Saddam was a menace to his own people. I mean, he was an absolute butcher. He ran that country in a way that Stalin would be salivating over with the highest of aspirations. I think that as far as it relates to the second facet, the international angle, under Saddam, they invaded Iran. Under Saddam, they invaded Kuwait. Under Saddam, they launched missiles at Israel. Under Saddam, they pursued nuclear weapons. Under Israel, they acquired weapons of mass destruction in the form of chemical weapons. And most importantly, because it's bad to possess them, it's worse by far, he used them. He used them on his own people. He was a menace in every way. He violated all four of the major conditions under which a country loses their sovereignty. And so in that sense, removing Saddam made not only Iraq safer, but made the Middle East safer and more stable. So that's my position.
Okay. So here's kind of the talking point of kind of the different aspects here. Now, like I say, I'm torn in a way, because I'm not going to sit here and carry. It's like there's a fair amount of meme or a fair amount of irony to say base Saddam or something like that. I'm going to be realistic. I'm going to take the mask off and say, yes, Saddam did awful things and everything else like that. But realistically, I know that there is no way that I'm going to be very careful with my language. Once again, I try to be careful with it. Arabic country, whether that be Saudi Arabia or Egypt or whoever else, was going to come in there and get rid of Saddam. There is no way that was going to happen. And ultimately, it fell to the United States. Now, that's not me agreeing with the war. That's not me saying it was a good thing. I'm just saying is that in practical terms, this is where it is. This is where we are. What I would say, though, in what has happened since then, though, is the creation of Hataib Hezbollah, which is the Iraqi version of the Lebanese Hezbollah. Of course, because as far as I know, I think for percentages in terms of Sunni Islam and Shia Islam is 55% Shia, which is why part of the reason why there were so many problems. Because obviously Shia Islam, of course, Iran being a Shia Muslim nation, there's a lot of, oh man, if I knew more about Islam, I would speak to it more. But I know that, there's a big disagreement with that. But I think there is the creation of that. You also had the, disbanding of the army completely. Even in World War II, the United States didn't completely dissolve the German Wehrmacht. Is that we still had MP units. We still had, border patrol, which a lot of them were ex-Wehrmacht. We had, SS guards, I think, at Nuremberg, I want to say. So, I mean, this idea that we're going to completely get rid of the Iraqi army, I don't know. You can say that, a lot of them surrendered this and that, but I think that there was still a core that would have been there that could have stayed on and helped to keep things together as a nation. Like I say, it's ironic because here we are, a Canadian and American, speaking about something that I probably shouldn't be speaking on, but I figured that I would bring it up to how your view is. I say that because today, Vosh was talking with Hakim, an Iraqi doctor, and of course, Marxist-Leninist. And ironically, of course, I think that, Hakim, of course, being a doctor, he was on night shift and everything else. The reason I say that is because it's his country. And I don't know all his background. It's none of my business. But ultimately, I know that there's some sort of irony that I bring it up. I guess what
I don't think there's any irony there. I don't think there's any irony there because at the end of the day, human rights, the human dignity is a universal thing. I mean, the Iraq War would have been just as valid if that had happened to be in Venezuela instead. Like just because it's Iraq, that's geography there. I mean, I didn't see the interview that you're talking about. I did see it in my notifications. I'm not subscribed to Vosh, but I do watch Vosh. I keep up with him. He's one of the few people that I go to get the view of the left to see what they're up to, basically. So I do watch them. I mean, I know people say, how can you watch Vosh? It's like, well, I used to watch Young Turks to get the left's viewpoint, but they're boring. At least Vosh is entertaining. So
yeah, I'll give you that. I used to do put Vosh clips on my channel to get clout, and now that there's a whole separate Vosh clips channel, it's like, well, okay, that game is past. So now I also asked my subscribers, should I put clips up? And they said, well, you can still put up the clips, just do commentary with it. So I'm like, okay, that's fair. But the reason I say this is because I think it's just worth saying is that this is something that's big between neoconservatism and everywhere else, where it's like, well, it's okay to do this. And of course, we've seen, I also saw this is an interesting point. We'll go ahead and move east a little bit towards Iran with the fact that there was I guess I'll go ahead and concede the issue with the Iraq war. Things happen, and ultimately the country is going to heal in its own way. There's a lot of division and everything else like that we helped to set up. But that, we'll go ahead and move on with that to the actual issue of Iran, which is there was a limpet mine that was found on an Iraqi ship recently. Now, people say that this is American, or other people are saying it's from this country or that country. We're not sure. But some say that this is a prelude to a potential war with Iran. This is something that Jason Unruh had. Take it with a grain of salt. I don't agree with him 100%, but there is that issue that's going on. There are two B-52s, I believe, that are in the area as well.
Yes, we covered that on the show. I did a video on this a couple of weeks ago. The USA sends two B-52s to spook Iran. So they did. That's true.
And, I do want to say this is that what Jason Unruh was saying, like I say, I genuinely disagree with him because there's a whole, I don't even want to get into that. But the issue that I do want to point out is that I think that with Iran is that this is something that, other socialists have talked about as well. I think there's a guy, Socialism for All. He talked about this as well, talking about would China get involved with a war in Iran if potentially happened, or even Russia, obviously, because they're, I was just looking at a map and I was like, dang, the Black Sea is that close, and you have a Black Sea flotilla for the Russian Navy, 17 ships, but nonetheless.
You mean Caspian Sea flotilla?
Oh, Caspian. Excuse me.
Yeah,
Caspian Sea. And I think the Caspian flotilla. I think if I'm correct, if I'm right about that, there are 17 ships that are there, and I think, like I say, that's a fairly small bit, but it's something that it could be an issue. And then, of course, you have to deal with the fact that Iran is a more mountainous nation. You have to deal with the other issues that there was the I'm trying to think of the name of the project offhand, but basically the War Games project that happened where I think it was the United States Marine
Millennium Challenge.
Yes, that's it. And basically they said, yeah, they were able to win, and because the United States stayed to their more conventional role, and this is why they ultimately lost. So, like I say, it would be massive amount of casualties. It would be further disruption. I think I can see. I'll try to be somewhat. I'll try to sympathize with you in this way, where you may think to yourself, is that okay? Hezbollah is going to lose leaders, whether that be legit Hezbollah in Lebanon or it's Hatayib Hezbollah, and you're not going to have as much influence, and Israel will be somewhat safer. I don't agree with those things because obviously I more understand the plight of the Palestinians, but we're not going to debate that. I'm just saying is that I'm trying to sympathize with you in that way, but I think that's not necessarily.
Just to clarify, what you mean is like by taking out the regime in Tehran, that it would weaken Hatib, Hezbollah, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's what you're getting at.
That's my assumption of. Do you think that?
I view Iran as actually a bigger threat than Katib, Hezbollah, or Hezbollah themselves. I view them basically as just augmentations of Iranian imperialism. That's kind of my view. But
okay. I just wanted to make sure on that because obviously I would think that that's kind of where you stand. I guess but with Iran, I feel like you're dealing with the nation that wants to protect itself ultimately, just like any other country does. I think that, and I'm sure that you would bring this up as well, is that, Iraq and Iran, now they have a much more porous area, Iran being a mostly Shia nation. And obviously, yes, there is a language barrier because obviously Iran, you're speaking Persian, and still in Iraq, you're speaking Arabic. So there is that difference. It's the same thing that goes on with Hezbollah in Lebanon, where, there is that difference. But I would say is that, to me, in a certain way, is that this would strengthen, further violence. I think is it.
Wait, which would?
With the attacking Iran and invading Iran. The reason I say that is because, and this is a point that I was going to talk about, kind of with Iraq. But after we saw Iraq and Afghanistan, we saw the rise of ISIS. We saw the attack in Brussels. We saw the attack in France. And we saw, I believe, an attack in Germany. Maybe, once again, you can correct me where I'm wrong. But so it didn't lessen terrorism.
Well, to be clear, in Iraq specifically, that was because Obama pulled out. That wasn't because Bush took out Saddam. It was the U.S. leaving that created the power vacuum. So,
yeah, okay, well, all right.
Like, I'm not a supporter of Obama. I was a supporter of Bush, but like Bush to go in was good. Obama, immensely critical. He left like 20 years too early there, so a minimum. So,
okay. Well, okay. Let's go ahead and do this because I do want to get an insight into, because I've heard you mention this before, like hardcore nation building. Can you just some bullet points about what you describe what that means? I guess,
sure.
In 20 years. Go ahead though. Yeah.
Sure. We can do that. I will get to that, but first I got a question for you quickly, just on the Iran thing. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons and that they will acquire nuclear weapons at some point in the future?
Yes. I'll just be honest. Yes.
So then when you talk about the violence that could emerge from, say, taking out Iran right now, I'm not going to necessarily disagree that it's going to be bloody. My counter will be waiting 20 years for them to nuke U.S. bases in the region, Israel, etc., potentially other allied countries, is going to be a lot bloodier. And so in that sense, it's kind of like doing war with Hitler in 36 versus waiting until 39. It's like, well, you went from 1 million dead to like 50 million dead. It's like, I'm not arguing it's going to be perfect. No war has ever been waged perfectly. Right. Even the fastest won war ever, where the British went to war against Zanzibar, that wasn't even perfect because they had one casualty in that war, even though they had total victory. They didn't get out of it unscathed. So war is not something that's ever perfect. And it's the same with Iraq, that you can say, well, Bremer disbanded the Ba'athist army, and that's true. And I think of all the criticisms in the handling of the Iraq war, disbanding the Ba'athist army is the best criticism, though I still, at the end of the day, would side with Bremer and the Bush administration did, and I get why they did it. But it's a bit more nuanced than that. It's a little bit more nuanced than that from my perspective, but we can get back to your question for me about what nation building actually looks like. But that's why I wanted to bring up the nuclear issue with Iran, because if a country is pursuing nuclear weapons, and we know their intent, better to do a conventional war where you lose 500,000 people than do a nuclear war where you lose 25 million people. That's my perspective on it. You're still saving 24.5 million lives there. So that's my kind of view. So, but I guess if you have a follow up to that, feel free, and then I can answer the question on nation building.
Okay, I'll just make a comment, and then I don't want to get too bogged down in that because I really do want to see, kind of how you think about how nation building is. But I will mention, the thing is that the DPRK has nukes. We see that Israel has nukes, Russia has nukes, and yet it's more of a trump card. It's more of an ace in the hole to say you don't want to mess with us. We don't want to have to use them. It's just kind of like it's kind of like maybe what Teddy Roosevelt said: "Speak softly and carry a big stick," sort of mentality, where it's just like, I
disagree on North Korea. I don't even necessarily disagree with you on Russia. I would actually say in Russia that's more or less kind of accurate, though I disagree with the Russian government. North Korea, I think they intend to use them as blackmail against America. I don't think they intend to actually have to use them, but they intend to use it to blackmail America to let them take the South and not intervene. That's my view.
Okay.
I don't think Russia would do that, by the way. I think Russia does have them more or less basically as a deterrent. I'm not on their side, but I don't think that Putin's going to be like, oh, we're going to invade here or we'll nuke you if you intervene. I don't think that Putin would do that. I don't like Putin, but he's not like the North Korean regime. He's not hell-bent on risking everything to take Europe. He wouldn't do that. The Kim regime, they'll do it once they feel that it'll work. So,
okay. I'll live with that. But yeah. So we'll go ahead and talk about what you think they think. Yeah, because I really do want to understand how, this 20-year time frame. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So why do nations ultimately fail? Well, one of the main reasons why nations actually wind up failing is because whether it be in Africa or the Middle East or elsewhere, it's that there's a lack of trust in contract enforcement, and there's a lack of independent legal institutions that are safe enough from bribery that they're actually seen as legitimate and able to compel people to obey the law. And so what I would do, my sort of version of what I would term hardcore nation building, is this doesn't even start until the war is basically over, the kinetic fighting. Once that's done and dealt with, you set up an administrative government. So if you're against me, you can call it a colony. If you're on my side, you can call it a transitionary mandate, whatever. It doesn't matter. I don't really care about semantics. You can call it colony. I don't care. You basically run it as directed from, say Washington, where you, for X period of time, are setting up the institutions of basically a sustainable democracy, because we understand that a liberal democracy doesn't just emerge overnight. You can't just say, oh, we took out your dictator, now you guys are democracy now. It's like, that's not how it works. I mean, Obama proved that with Libya and proved that with Afghanistan to a large extent. That the problem that we have is that you need to lay down the law, you need to set up a judiciary, and you need to appoint officials there that are independent of whatever cronies happen to be in the government and whatnot. You need to basically step in and say, we're setting up a government. This government is going to operate at our direction for some amount of time until it's ready to survive on its own. And we're going to basically copy the US system and put it over here, but we're going to do it in a way that we recognize that if we just let that transpire, it would devolve into chaos. Right now, we're going to have 20 years to show everybody, say, for example, or 18 years, however long it is, that yes, your contracts will be enforced. The judiciary is independent of the president. They do not take bribes. If the Supreme Court rules something, they can overrule the president. The president doesn't just get to make himself immune or whatever, this kind of stuff. And you basically set up a copy of the American system. And then after an amount of time, after, say, 20 years of stability, the kinetic energy has been over, the war's been long won, you can then eventually leave, and the people are confident enough that that system's going to keep going. And if anybody tries to corrupt it, it would be like trying to corrupt the U.S. system. A lot of people have accused the Orange Man, Donald Trump, of saying he's destroying our democracy. Well, no, American democracy is incredibly resilient. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't make himself Hitler. Couldn't happen. Whereas in a new fledgling, quote unquote, democracy, like what we have been seeing in Afghanistan or Iraq, it's actually very easy to turn it into a dictatorship all over again. So that's why a 20-year colony under the direction of Washington is the lesser evil. It's the only way that you can really do it. It's the only way that you can transform a non-Western area, a non-Western sort of civilization, if you will, into a Western one. You basically you have to do that so that people can trust the system, because you'd be a fool to trust the Afghanistan system right now to not be corrupt. I mean, it's an improvement over the Taliban, but you can't really call that nation building as I would like to see it. So that's my view. That's my view. So.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Afghanistan, because I was going to bring that up, and kind of how we were moving there. We're moving east a little bit, but I decided I'm going to choose another one. Since you did mention Afghanistan, let's move out of there. Let's go to another place called Vietnam. And the reason I bring that up is because Ho Chi Minh, I believe, correct me where I'm wrong, and you may have heard this, but Ho Chi Minh asked for U.S. assistance before he went to China and the Soviet Union to say, can we get the U.S. Constitution? And basically, the Americans blew him off and said, nah, we're not going to help you. as far as I know. And of course, then we have the issue of South Vietnam, the huge amount of corruption that occurred. The folks that were, getting, limousines brought in. I can't think of the name of the president offhand, but the folks that were being shot in the street and all that business. And of course, the Buddhist monk setting himself on fire. I know that's random stuff, but in general, and also during the famous picture, of course, I think of the South Vietnamese general shooting that suspected Viet Cong in the head with the revolver. So I mean,
right. No, I see what you're getting at, is that there's corruption there. I guess the difference is there's a difference between a puppet state or a client state and tolerating what goes on there, because you could talk about South Korea. South Korea was actually a dictatorship until like the 90s,
yes,
but it was obviously an ally against North Korea, against communism. Did they do things that you could say that dirtied your hands? It's like, yes. Were they the lesser evil? Absolutely. It's the same with South Vietnam. It's like, yeah, in that case, that kind of stuff happens, but it's like, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the red bloc and the misery and the hundreds of millions. Well, at least 100 million people that died there. It's like we're talking about a drop in the ocean compared to it. It's the same thing with Pinochet. Did Pinochet kill some people extrajudicially? Absolutely. Was it anything like what happened in Cuba? Anything like what happened in Albania? No, nowhere near. And the difference is Cuba and Albania, still very poor, suffering from the aftermath of it. Chile today, rich as hell, relatively speaking. So it's a lesser evil. So I'm a fan of Jean Kirkpatrick, and she talks about that idea that you have to work with some bad actors if you want to win, because your enemy, they work with bad actors, and if they win, you're never ever going to have good actors. Whereas if we win, we can transform those bad actors into good actors over time. But we have to win the Cold War first. That's my stance on that. So I don't really care what happened in South Vietnam or South Korea. It's like, it was the Cold War. So
I guess I can agree to a point with that in terms of pragmatism. I think it's the same. This is the same type of thing. Now, this is just I'm speaking I'm vaguely socialist, Nosvo-esque. I'll put it that way. But this is something that I think, just to say that in general with left-wing folks, this is something kind of a defense for them a little bit. They don't all fully agree with Assad. I'll put it that way. Is that they support him for anti-imperialist reasons. Do they completely agree with him? Absolutely not. But they say that it is better to support him now and then to eventually overthrow him in a communist revolution. That is the. I'm saying. Have you heard that before?
Well, okay. I'm not as versed in like the left wing sort of different angles. I know that you've got your tankies and then you've got your anarchists and stuff and everything. I think the idea that you could do that against Assad is ludicrous. The Assad system is tremendously difficult to overthrow. I mean, without outside intervention. Those people they sound absolutely insane to me. Those people sound like out of their minds. It's like, I mean, there are a lot of people out there that will support Assad, even though they'll call him a bad guy, because they'll say, but it's his sovereignty. Like, you'll have a lot of like Western progressives and stuff that'll say like, hands off Syria and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, if you ask them, hey, look, he's butchered 200,000 people. Isn't that bad? They'll be like, it's bad, but war bad. In other words, you can kill 100 million people, but if a war kills one person to kill the guy who killed 100 million people, oh, that's imperialism, bro. So that's kind of like the issue that I see with that all the time. That's why I like on my meme page, I've got a lot of like war bad memes. It's like X atrocity happened, but war bad. It's like, okay, but there are worse evils in the world than war, So what you're talking about is like this idea that like they support him because I guess they see him as like some accelerationist fantasy that he'll be an easier thing to overthrow than whatever the alternative is. That's kind of crazy. So
that's what I heard, because I've and this is quite a while back, but this is something that they'll say, and this is not something I completely agree with, but it's something that they'll say. Well, yeah, Assad is a neo-lib, but he's easier. This is what they'll say, and this is a long time ago. This is something
neoliberal Bashar al-Assad. That's a new one. That's a new one. Neo-lib Assad. that's crazy. I'm gonna run that by like the low Twitter people that don't really like me. Just be like, yo, this guy in your squad. My guess is probably not. They probably don't like him either. But.
Right. Yeah. Like I said, that's just something I heard, and I only just say that just kind of as an off point. I think ultimately, I will say this to you: is that I can agree with that pragmatic point of view. I don't agree with it because ultimately, I still see that the United States, in general, has not had the greatest track record. But ultimately, that's not our point. I think that we were in Vietnam, so we're going to make our way back to. Let's do this as a side point. Is that you said that excuse me. Sorry for the.
I think we should probably bring it back to China because, ideally, I'd like to wrap this up by the top of the hour, so 20 more minutes. So, just to get it back to the crux of the discussion, which was initially, protectionism in China. But I mean, obviously, China's got its tentacles around the world. So, obviously, a lot of the cases we brought up were pretty relevant to the discussion. So, I think just on another point that you did mention, though, about Iran and if Russia and China would get involved. Yeah. They're only going to get involved if they want to die. They, in other words, Russia and China. Yeah, if America calls their bluff and goes in, they're not going to be like, oh, look, we will warn you if you do anything, you'll meet our wrath, bro. And then America goes in and they're like, oh, well, if we do anything, that would be a nuclear war, and then we wouldn't have our Mercedes anymore. So no, Putin and Xi Jinping, they're going to back off. They would not risk their power to get nuked. To save Iran, they would throw Iran under the bus. I guarantee it. That's my view. Hell, even with North Korea, China would throw North Korea under the bus if a war happened. Right now, they side with them as like, look, we don't want U.S. troops on their border. But when they know that it's going to be U.S. troops on their border or they get nuked, they're not going to do anything. So because they would lose, the U.S. would destroy their society in 45 minutes. So
okay, yeah. What I was going to bring up though is. I was going to bring it back to Vietnam because I think that you said, I mentioned in a comment, we were talking about FDR, I think. I find it hilarious that you think that FDR is a socialist, but that's a whole, like I said, that's a whole.
He was a socialist. He admired Stalin. He admired the 5-year plans. He tried to build socialism in America, man.
Well, okay. Now, once again, this is something that I would think that FDR was more of a social democrat. He wasn't really, he had people that were socialists that ultimately bent to the will, but for the most part, his programs, like I say, once again, I'm sure that we'll both agree on this. Most of his plans were failures. The reality, though, is that
I would agree with that. So there's some common ground.
He wasn't a successful wannabe socialist. Ultimately, he was a social democrat at best. It's the same thing. It's that this is something that I think a lot of socialists will say is that ultimately, it's either we're going to create fascism, in a sense, to when capitalism is declined, or we're going to have social democracy as more of a social fascism. And like I say, this is the first time when I mentioned it, but that's a whole other discussion. I'll put it that way. But basically, I just don't think that was the case at all. But the thing is, though, is that now that Vietnam, of course, is now one country, and now at least in name, even past the Doi Moi reforms, Vietnam is a socialist country. But yet you said that you'd be willing to have jobs go to Vietnam instead of going to China. And in terms of protectionism, I say, but yeah, I guess we'll talk about that.
That's something that, like, for the most part, I want to be very clear about something here. I'm not one of those people who views Vietnam as like, oh, we'll just balance against China and we'll we'll basically do that kind of stuff with them. When I talked about that, I'm talking about in a very short run context. By the way, I don't regard even the Vietnam War as over, because for them, I'm kind of again with Gene Kirkpatrick on this one. Right wing or reactionary dictatorships that are aligned with the United States are much easier to leverage when you're working with them than left-wing socialist sort of dictatorships like Vietnam. I guarantee it. Vietnam is going to require finishing that war to turn them non-communist. And so in that sense, yes, you can in the short run undermine China, work with them, but you won't really be able to apply the same leverage as you could on somebody like Pinochet, or say with the Contras, or in any of these other client states throughout the world and in Africa, because at the end of the day, their ideology is just so anathema and they're so opposed. Even though their people really love America, they're the one country where the meme of greeted as liberators would most come true. Like if America finished the job in Vietnam right now, it wouldn't be like the old Vietnam War. The American or the Vietnamese people love the United States and they love American capitalism more. This is the ironic part, more than most Europeans do. How sad is that? I mean, they owe their existence, their safety from the Soviets and earlier the Nazis to American capitalism and defense, and yet the Vietnamese people they outdo the Europeans across the board, with the exception of maybe Britain. But
yeah. Well, like I say, I don't fully agree with that. Like you say, I mean, if the people do that, and of course, like I say, the Doi Moi reforms have changed a lot. There's another guy, I'll put you onto this. Have you heard of a guy named Non-Compete? A guy named American Johnson?
Okay, I've heard the name Non-Compete before. I think I watched maybe 5 minutes of one of his shows, and it was dry and boring. And in my head, and maybe this is a straw man, maybe this is just my very anecdotal evidence here, I got block text the left can't meme vibes from Non-Compete, but that's just me. I don't know.
Okay. The reason I say that is because American Johnson is American. He was a marketer who I guess, was in South Carolina is where he grew up, went to South Korea, and now he's in Vietnam. He used to call her a comrade, but now I think it's like girlfriend or something like this. Just gossip at this point. I'm just saying this is an off point. If you want to get some more insight into it, he has this comrade, as he calls it, this Luna Oi, who does stuff about Vietnam because obviously she's native Vietnamese. She's talked a little bit about what I found interesting was talking about the Hmong. I know I'm mispronouncing it, but basically the Montagnards, which apparently is a not so nice term. It's a French term about Vietnam, but I think that it's interesting to talk about because, of course, he's an American living in Vietnam, a narco-communist. Even I have to say, look, I don't like a narco-communist. I'm more of if I had to make a choice, I would choose the MLs because at least they had, I think, I've heard you say that, at least MLs had a working state. It wasn't great, but it worked.
Oh, no. Here's the one thing that I'll say. I've had conversations with actual straight up tankies that have said that like they actually have more respect for neocons than for anarcho-communists, because they're like, hey, look, you guys at least have wins. Like you guys at least forge the world into your image and apply military force and stuff. Whereas with the anarcho-communists, I've said it before. Look, anarcho-communists get BTFO'd by weak fascist regimes that just ruffle stomp them. Whereas weak fascist regimes get owned by communist regimes that ruffle stomp them. But communist regimes either get bankrupted or raffle stomped over by capitalist systems like America. And so in that sense, in the hierarchy of things, you have the anarcho-communists who are like the weakest. And then there are the tankies who are stronger but inefficient and stagnant. And then you have the capitalist neocon ghouls who are strong and efficient. So that's kind of like the hierarchy of strength in that terms. So I can see why like tankies and Nazbols and stuff don't really like the anarcho-commies, because it's like they're not even a thing. How would they ever survive? Like they'll argue, well, the problem is the reason why Catalonia fell, etc., was that the whole world was an anarchist and that it would work if the whole world was anarchist. But it's like if the whole world was anarchist, then if 5 guys get together and form a state, they'll take over the world. That's the problem, right? Like a state has the advantage over literal anarchy. Like their ideology, the end goal of their ideology is literally a power vacuum. So what happens in a power vacuum? Somebody fills it, right?
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point too. It's like I've heard that basically a lot of people see anarcho-communism as, like I say, once again, this I know that you'll cringe at this, but they see it as kind of like a form of liberalism, because they'll talk about human rights, and they'll talk about transgenderism is okay and everything else, but that's kind of the ignorant view. Like I say, I'm trying to get an understanding and all that business. I guess I would say this. Let's go ahead. We've already kind of come to Vietnam, and obviously China and Vietnam had the war in 1979.
Yeah, we should probably get back to China just as a heads up.
I mean, you got to wrap it up. He's like, I'm gonna dip out pretty soon here.
Okay.
So
no
I'm already over my time, and I don't even think I need to be here. Honestly, you guys are fine. So
yeah, no problem. Have a good night, Henry. I'll just be polite. Try to be polite.
So Henry, are you going to roll out now, or are you able to stay for another 10 minutes or so?
I mean, I can. I don't think I need to though. You guys,
fair enough.
Fine, I think. I mean, it's been totally fine. So I'll, if it's okay with everybody, I'll just dip out.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks for moderating, Henry. I'll say that to everybody in the chat. Go and follow Henry. You can find him on Twitter at American Madhouse with no A, and you can also follow him on YouTube at American Madhouse with an A. So, and then where can the people find you, by the way, Thomas, if they're interested?
Well, they can find me, of course, at Uncle Tom. Basically, you can look for me on YouTube, primarily. Just Uncle Thomas. I've pretty much got the corner marketed or market cornered basically on, once you type in Uncle Thomas, there's my face of Magnum PI there for the Avi. There it is. There's a lot
Tom Selleck?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, we have almost the same amount.
I was thinking it was Uncle Tom's Cabin type thing.
Oh, well, that's kind of the double entendre. That's kind of the But
I'm just noticing right now, like we have a fairly similar number of views. You're almost at 100,000. I'm like just over 80,000. Yeah, so you do YouTube too. So
so I do that primarily. I have the Ko-Fi and all that business. It's we're still kind of getting that worked out. I try to just keep it to YouTube. Usually I just do just kind of my rants and raves. It's kind of like briefly. I'll just go ahead and mention this and then we'll finish up. But I would say that there's a lot of folks, and this is something that I disagree with, is people will say, it's like Bernie Sanders will even say, oh, well, America's the richest nation in the world. And I'm kind of like, well, I don't really believe that. And I know you believe in the idea of American exceptionalism. The reason I say that is because, okay, corporations can be rich. Individuals can be rich. But the whole country, that's a matter of opinion. It's like you can go into some places that are, it's like you can look at some, like mayor's offices or something like that. It's the 1970s in there. So it's like, obviously they want to show that they're not being corrupt or something else like that. It's like, you go downstairs and it's like, you'll see, old wood paneling or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it's like, when I see this sort of thing, America's the richest nation in the world, it's like, yeah, corporations and individuals are. And even then it's based on the value of money. It's like, okay, yeah, the American dollar is rich now, but if the United States dollar collapsed, then it's just paper. It's just toilet paper, and it's just ones and zeros, that aren't worth anything. So I mean, like I say, and I'm sure you can disagree with that, but that's
true for any currency. That's true for the Chinese yuan too. Like it's all fiat at the end of the day. It's all arbitrary. It only has value because people ascribe value to it, right? So
that's fair. Where should we finish up with China? I guess I'll finish up with China in terms of let me see. So we've talked about kind of the bulwark a little bit. We mentioned some potential allies like with Australia, and then kind of possibly Canada to some degree. I'm not sure about Trudeau and all that business or what they think, and the UK, I think, because obviously the UK doesn't have that many friends, obviously, because now it's just them. There's no EU around them. They just have their own, I guess, ruled Britannia, but Britannia no longer rules the waves, so to speak. And so basically they have no other choice than to say, well, okay, they've kind of become the junior compared to the United States, and now they're just kind of hooked together in a certain way. That's how I view it anyway. So I guess, I guess I would say
relationship. Yeah, they definitely have a special relationship. Like the UK and Israel and Canada all have respective special relationships that not really any other countries have to the United States in that sense. But
yeah, so I guess my last question for this, and then we can wrap it up from here, is what do you think the potential bulwark would be to China right now? because obviously we see, I'll just briefly explain, but obviously the EU has their deal with China. We see that Israel kind of split back and forth, kind of split loyalties, but they obviously do have some business dealings with China. We see the potential, South America, obviously we see Venezuela, we see I'll just say Venezuela for now. Chinese troops there. We have I can't really speak for the rest of South American nations, but in general, it just seems like we're going to have to see in the future what that bulwark is going to be. So I guess, but yeah, what do you think that bulwark would look like? I'll just simplify that.
Yeah, I'll answer that, and then I guess we'll go to our sort of closing remarks. We don't have a moderator anymore because Henry had to go to bed because it's like late in Texas. But the thing is, what we'll do basically is I'll answer that. As far as the bulwark against China's ambitions, I believe it is an ascendant and absolute conviction on the part of the United States and her loyal allies to resist, and not only just resist and contain, but at the end of the day, and I should say resist and contain China, but that at the end of the day, we need to recognize that not only in this Cold War are we going to have to deal with this rival as we had to with the old Soviet Union, but now we've got our own quote-unquote allies that are becoming indebted and ingratiated to them in a way that the Soviets never could have dreamed of, and that's a problem. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to cut off the relationship with China, and we're also going to have to turn to our own friends and say, look, if you continue that relationship with them, you yourself are getting sanctioned. Like, I don't even consider Switzerland in any way an ally. Switzerland's definitely getting sanctioned. Would Germany get sanctioned? Probably, because Merkel's very weak. Merkel might actually, Merkel already simped Iran. What's that?
I hate to interrupt you. Merkel's going to leave, isn't she? At least that's what people are saying. But
possibly, but the thing is, whether it's her or it's somebody else, they have a history in modern Germany of basically corrupt leaders that work with the Russians and work with Iran, and now they're going to start working with China, and then thinking that the Orange Man in Washington are arrogant and they're right wing and stuff, bro. Meanwhile, let us simp for a fascist petrostate that gives us cheap oil and basically has us by the balls. And it's like, when I look at this and I say, look, we need to understand, like, yes, we have the iPhones, we have Fortnite, we have all like these cushy things now, but at the end of the day, we're basically in the 1950s where we're in dire times. History is going to regard this period as a pivotal point. History is going to regard this period as an early Cold War stage. And what happened in the early 1950s? Drastic action was taken. The Marshall Plan, people would say today, what would they say? You can't do the Marshall Plan. You'd have to like print money for that, man. And you'd have to like spend money and like, and that'd be bad. And like, why not keep that money here, man? Whereas now, like we need to take drastic action. We need to have a similar focused Marshall Plan initiative in Africa and Latin America to ward off Chinese influence. And we need to have sanctions imposed against the European Union if they're going to continue that relationship with China. We need to basically move towards getting to a point where we can blockade communist China and say, we're preventing anything getting in your country, going out of your country, so that we can even foment the people there to uprise against them, because the people will come for Xi Jinping's head on a platter if he can't deliver the jobs. That's one reason why the Communist Party stays in power, is that they say, well, things might suck under us, but at least you have a job. If they don't have that anymore, then yeah, they're done. They're done, son. And so in that sense, all that it really takes is political will in Washington. I've said it before. At the end of the day, you could have a country that's 100 times stronger than another country, but if the country that's 100 times weaker has even 10 times more willpower than the country that's 100 times stronger, that 100 times stronger country with no willpower, say a leader like Obama or something, they're going to lose. Like, it's the reason why Putin's been winning in Europe and in Syria and everything, because the West has weak leaders. And so what will be the bulwark? The bulwark will be, as I call for on this channel, the emergence of a neoconservative renaissance post Biden and Trump. That's my hope. I hope we get 8 years of Nikki Haley, and I hope we get another 8 years of a strong, hawkish Republican leader thereafter that will seriously get tough on the enemies of freedom. We've lost so much in the years since George W. Bush. It's going to take a long time to regain that ground. We don't just have to regain it. We have to push back, and we have to secure the world for our hegemony in that sense. So that's my view on that. The bulwark is a unilateral and morally sincere and strong conviction in the United States and our allies that we are the best, and we're going to forge the world in our image, and nobody can stop us. So that's my view. That's my view, I guess. And that in that way, that's almost basically my closing statements. You made the first opening statement, so you can make the last closing statement.
All right. That sounds good to me. All right. So really, I wanted to come into this, to be honest with you, just so we can have an understanding. And like I said, a lot of the time, with social media, is that it's easy to just type out and spurg out and make a lot of comments. I'll be honest with you, and I'll try to be somewhat more mature and be more mature. Is it, I'm the same guy that was on Twitter that said to you, basically, that showed you the Osama bin Laden picture. I think I'm that same guy. I don't really promote that Twitter, but anyway. And so I think in retrospect, I will say that it's somewhat disingenuous that I did that. And really, I
don't even remember the exact picture. I forget. Can you describe the picture exactly?
Yeah, basically it was Osama bin Laden, 1993. It was a U.S. newspaper that said basically that Osama bin Laden was a freedom fighter against the Soviets.
Yes, I do recall that one, and I said, look, I'll say on the record right now, because the people might think it's like a bad thing or whatever. He did good work against the Soviets. I know that that's a hot take. People could say, oh, but what about the blowback? They knew there would be inevitable blowback. The Soviets had 40,000 nukes aimed at America. Even the blowback that occurred was not as bad as what the Soviets would have done to America. Al-Qaeda has killed, we're talking about tens of thousands of people. The Soviets in 1 hour very well could have killed half of the American population. So there's a bit of a difference there. You have to work with some bad apples. So that's my stance.
Okay. I'm not going to be petty. I'll leave that there. What I will say, though, is I can appreciate your pragmatism. And I realize, like I say, I think that there's a lot of times this is something that is a problem for the extremes. I know that you talk about the far left and the far right, and I know that you have people like McCarthyism on who say, well, we should arrest them all. And I don't.
He does. It's kind of true. Like, he is an actual, honest to God McCarthyist. It's
and I'm just, I'm like, I don't. It's like the same thing when y'all were talking about, well, let's, how are we going to break up Russia? And I'm like, okay. It's like, so I've done a little bit of.
Wait, but Thomas, let's just take a moment to just kind of step back and realize that, like, all this stuff that I've talked about, where I've been kind of on the defensive, defending actions of America and everything, you do identify as an Nazbol, which means you're kind of okay with the Chinese doing that to anybody that they consider to be a threat, or the Russians doing it to anybody that they consider a threat. Like, by the way, I understand why the CCP views the Uyghurs as a problem. I'm not saying that I support them or anything. It's the same reason why I understand why Kim wants nukes. It's like, he's my enemy, but I understand why he wants them, right?
Yeah, so. And that's, I tried to talk about that earlier, where it's like, I understand it's like, you can see why they do it. It's just that I think that you said this before, where it's like, you understand why they do it, but you don't sympathize with them. I think
I understand why they do it. And like, if I were communists trying to take over the world for China's glory and stuff, I would be doing the same thing. Like I've said it before, I think that the Kims in particular, I mean, all three of them, but in particular, I usually focus on Kim Jong-il the most. They're actually geniuses in this sense, because there are a lot of dictators out there that have screwed up, made a lot of dumb mistakes. I'm not talking about dumb mistakes as in like killing their people and stuff. It's like, no, as far as being a successful dictator, what does that mean? It means you consolidate your power, you eliminate not just any rivals, you eliminate the possibility of any rivals emerging. The Kim dynasty has done that. I mean, without external intervention, they will go on for 10 million years, as their propaganda claims, 100%. There could never even potentially be an indigenous uprising there. It's just out of the question. Kim Jong-il, he died of natural causes, worth billions of dollars, had his swag bends and everything else, very successful dictator. And it wasn't just luck. He also had what Machiavelli would have called virtuoso, virtue. And he didn't mean that in the moral sense. He meant it in the sense that he knew what he was doing. Those guys incredibly smart. I think that we are woefully remiss in the West to regard North Korea as a big meme that we can just laugh about and say, oh, he likes Katy Perry, fun times. It's like, no, they know what the fuck they're doing. And just because we play devil's advocate to get inside their head, yeah, I've got a video on devil's advocacy. You do that your whole life. At some point, you eventually become the devil. You become indistinguishable. I do it as an exercise to get the upper hand, to see where they're thinking and where they're coming from. My goal is to vaporize his head, right? I'm not on his side. Like, I understand why he feels scared, but like, I want to kill him. So, you know, that's my perspective. Like, I mean, he's an enemy of the free world. So,
like I say, that just kind of goes back to my original point, is that I just wanted that understanding. It's like, we're not going to see eye to eye, and that's fine. But as long as people have that understanding, it's like, it's easier to accept someone as they are. I'm going to try to use a Malcolm X quote, and this is something I heard actually from an Ice Cube album when I used to really listen to hip hop. Is that it goes something like this? Let me see if I can remember it correctly. But it's like, basically, I have more respect for a man who means what he says and says what he means. And he was talking about South Africa in this case. And he says, South Africa practices apartheid and preaches apartheid. He says, but unlike this, with America, he says that, America preaches integration and practices segregation. And I know that, there are holes in this argument. He says that, preaches integration, practices segregation. And I'd rather have a man who means what he says and says what he means than an angel that is going to come out and is nothing but a devil. So and I don't mean that in any discriminating way or anything else like that, but I can respect that you mean what you say. And while we may disagree, and while I'm still an American at the end of the day, and while, I'll put it this way. Like I said, I'm kind of schizo and I've kind of been all over the place, but I will say this is that, you'll have people like Gray Zone, Max Blumenthal, and you'll have folks who will say, basically is that they were, he was against Assad. And then he said, well, yeah, now we support Assad. Now he's going to Syria, this and that. And of course, like I say, he's, man, I'm going to make myself look like more of a hypocrite. I'm going to do it anyway, nonetheless, and of course, Jimmy Dore is now aligning with them in many ways. And like I say, I will just say this, and I know that you've neckbeard Jimmy and all this. What I will say,
yes, neckbeard Jimmy. That's the meme.
What I will say is that what I will say about Jimmy Dore, beyond all the stuff that's come out, beyond the $2.1 million house and all that, I appreciate the energy. That's all I can really say. Is it right completely? And that, there are a lot of lefties who disagree with him. Even Michael Brooks, before he died, disagreed with him and said, actually learn about the issues, this and that. But I will just say is that at least we have an understanding between you and I, and it's like, I don't worry, I will finish up within a couple minutes. But I will say is that a lot of the time with the internet is you can troll people and say ha ha ha, or what about this thing, or what about that thing, and accuse people of stuff and go back and forth typing. And it's easier to do that and be a keyboard warrior. But once we have this understanding, then we can say, okay, this is where he comes from. I don't completely understand, respect it. And obviously we had a little bit of back and forth about Iraq, but we had that understanding. And it's like, okay. And I can see, I'll put it to you this way, is that I may not agree with a lot of what the policy is in bombing people, this and that, but ultimately I will say this about at least our conversation. I can't speak for all neocons, but that there's an understanding that, we work with people that we don't like. And this is the pragmatism that we have. I mean, in a lot of ways, there's Machiavelli, obviously, and I have Machiavelli books that I should read one of these days.
Oh man, you should read The Prince. I think you'll like The Prince, and I think you'll even more than The Prince. I think you'll like Discourses on Livy. Yeah, that's the big pill. That's the big pill, because he says, look, you want to survive as a democracy in times of crisis, you have to think like a dictator. You want to survive as a dictator in a time of crisis, you kind of have to think like a Democrat. That is a big pill for 600 years ago. You know, that's some potent stuff right there. I really like Machiavelli. So
yeah, I would say this too, is that there's kind of like the meme going around, at least, you know, in the spheres that I roam, I'll put it that way, where there's also, have you heard of Carl Schmitt?
Yeah, well, I'm aware of Carl Schmitt. The thing is, I haven't actually read anything of Carl Schmitt, though, but I'm aware, you know, of his role in terms of Nazi philosophy, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and that's something I wish that I could get into as well. But I think that he's kind of a counterpoint to that, where he's talking about the enemy and the friend sort of deal. And so he's talked a little bit about that as well. So, I mean, that's kind of more of a proper context. But I know I was all over the place. Apologies. Just kind of, when I think something, I just got to get it out. But that's, anyway, I think that overall, I think we had a good conversation. I
think for people that are basically on essentially opposite ends of the political spectrum and not, you know, in the, it's horseshoe theory, they kind of see eye to eye and stuff. No, like we actually have like really fundamental disagreements on stuff. I think that this was probably the most sort of cordial and productive debate or discussion that a neocon and a Nazbol have ever had on the internet. That's what I would say. That's what I would say here. And I know that there's a stereotype that, you know, neocons and stuff, you know, they do their boomers and they work at think tanks and they write papers that reach like 200 people that all happen to be like in their same circle, but they can't really debate or defend their ideas in public discourse. It's like, well, no, I'm here to buck that trend. Like I'm here, you know, I'll debate anybody at this point. You know, you challenge me, you come on my show. Like I said, you get to mirror it on your channel. I 100% am 100% confident in defending my views, right? So, yeah. and that's the thing, and I think that's one thing that, you know, when it comes down to it, I think the one thing that maybe neocons and Nazbols kind of have in common in a way is that we're beyond, like we have a conviction that we're beyond this sort of virtue signaling kind of thing, because it would be easy for me to come out here and say, oh, working with Pinochet was bad. Pinochet killed people and that was bad. We shouldn't have done that. And it's like, yeah, but I know in my heart of heart, if you treated the world that way, you would have lost the Cold War. It's like, and the Soviets would have won. It's like, no, I'm straight up. I'll defend actions that look bad in the greater good. And Nazbols have their own image of the greater good that I completely disagree with, but they also are at least honest. Like, I guess what I'll say, the one thing that neocons and Nazbols kind of have in common is our honesty, regardless of what people think of us. That's all that I can really say in terms of not really a compliment, but just an acknowledgement to your side of the issue. So
I would say this just as a final question, and then we'll just wrap it up after this. We're not gonna make this into 3 hours. Don't worry. I'll finish this in the last. So when you say Nazbol, what do you think of? I'll put it that way.
Yeah, when I think of Nazbol, I'm generally thinking of basically, you know, what comes to mind is like in sort of just the ideological sense of things. I'm thinking of like, you know, the fourth political theory. I'm thinking of like Alexander Dugin, or I'm thinking of like the Zoomers that are inspired by Dugin that live in the West that also say, you know, oh, well, basically I'm a fascist with you know, basically Bolshevik characteristics, that kind of thing. That's what comes to mind. You know, apart from like red flags with black hammers and sickles, that kind of thing. Right. You know.
Well, I do have to, like I said, it is in the Nazbol handbook, so I have to say this because that's, you know, the typical view of Nazbol. But there's also the German side. Before Hitler took over, there is a gentleman by the name of Karl Otto Peitel, who came up with the National Bolshevik Manifesto. And so while he wasn't as anti-Semitic, he didn't really promote anti-Semitism. He promoted race in a more organic way. He later went to the United States and, you know, really supported Cuba, this and that. And I know, like I say, I realize that Nazbol in general is a meme, and ultimately I will still call myself a socialist, so I don't alienate people too much and say that's just a meme ideology. But I will say is that, you know, there was this gentleman, Karl Otto Peitel, who came up with that. Very interesting guy, Carl Otto Pytel. But there's also a gentleman by the name of, oh my gosh, I'm blanking, Ernst Niekisch. Now, Ernst Niekisch wrote a magazine. It was called Widerstand, Resistance, and he didn't agree with Hitler either. He promoted more of, and what a lot of these Nazis at this time agreed with was basically aligning with the Red Army, and a little bit separate from what the Communist Party did, the KPD did, and basically say that they wanted to create a Prussian Bolshevism, maybe along the lines of what Bismarck wanted. And Ernst Niekisch was put in a concentration camp and was practically blind by the time he left, and was in the German Democratic Republic and got fed up with it and left. And so I think I'm just going to be honest. I'll finish up on this point just as a more honest thing to say that if you ever do encounter another Nazgul online, or you encounter,
it happens all the time, man. Like they tend to cluster in my replies and stuff.
Yeah,
something about what I do.
I would say in general is that people see, I think, National Bolshevism in a way as we never really got a shot to completely do it. We'll look at people like Dukin and say, he may have had some ideas here and there, but ultimately, let's go back to the beginning and see, like I say, with Carl Otto Pytel and Ernst Niekisch, to say what could have been. And of course, like I say, just in case people get the mistaken idea, it's like National Bolshevists in general, we do not agree with Strasserism. We want to be separate from that. Just like I said, I want to make sure here, I want to present a good show for National Bolshevism, just in case that I'm not officially that, but I would say in general is that we are separate from Strasserism. Otto Strasser worked with the British. He basically just said, we need to apologize. In his book, Germany Tomorrow, we need to apologize. We need to give that land back to Poland. We need to do all this. Basically, he was somebody who wanted to go back to like a rural sort of feudalism. So just like I said, I'm just doing that basically just for the audience and just for folks who say, I want to keep my Nazgul card, basically. I want to be able to still have it. So I want to say that, Nazgul and Strasserist are two different things. And also there's the meme of, everyone that there's a Strasserist is ultimately transitioning. We'll put it that way. I'm not going to, like I say, I don't want to get you in trouble. So I'll just say that they're transitioning and they have a particular flag. So I'll put it that way. But yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Ultimately, I appreciate the conversation.
Well, before we wrap this up, though, I have a question for you then as a follow-up. So what comes to mind when you think of neoconservatism? Same question, basically.
Okay. So neoconservatism. Now, this is something that, I've heard a lot of the lore, this and that. Ultimately, I'm sure you've heard it before, but the idea that, this is something that evolved from Trotskyism and the idea of permanent revolution. And basically you had people like, Bill Kristol and other folks like that who kind of synthesized this idea. And now we see it as
I think you mean Irving Kristol, right? You're talking about the old guy, right? Because Bill Kristol, I don't think Bill Kristol is really into Trotskyism. But.
Oh, okay. Excuse me. And people like, I'm thinking of a different guy. I was going to say Christopher Hitchens. And people,
he was never a neocon. Let's just be clear on the record here. He rejected the label. He worked with the neocons to support the Iraq War. He was what you could basically consider to be a secular Marxist. He really rejected a lot of American capitalism and exceptionalism in some ways. So, and nationalism and sort of a lot of conservative values in a lot of his work. But
okay, well, that's good. At least we have that kind of cleared up. I will. Yeah, that's definitely. I'm glad we had that that distinction made, because obviously, like I say, there's plenty of misnomers about things, and at least we have that understanding. I would like to say, just in if there's ever a time that you need someone to debate or something like that, you can just send me a link, and I can come on and we can have some sort of talk. Or whatever, but I understand that, you have other folks to be, and it'd be kind of selfish to be like, well, it's my turn again. And you've got other people.
No. We can debate again in the future. I think the internet, by and large, I think the internet likes to see like opposing ideologies come into debate. Like it's good for views. It's generally a good forum to like kind of see, oh, what does the other side actually think of us? Like, because like you asked me, what do I think of like Nazbols? I'm thinking like Dugan and like the Zoomer sort of acolytes and stuff that aspire to be like him. And then I asked you what do you think of neocons? And you basically say like, Trotskyism in a way. It's like, those are the memes, I guess. Those are the memes. But it's like, I'll tell you this. I actually think that this is a little bit of a hot take here, maybe. I don't know if this is going to get me in trouble or whatever. I can tell you the neocons, ever since Irving Kristol saw the light, not really Trotskyist, but maybe there's some people out there that this might trigger. I actually don't shed any tears that Stalin put an ice pick in Trotsky's head. I totally get why he did it. And in fact, I'll say this about Trotsky. If Trotsky had taken over the Soviet Union, I can't say that more people would have died, but definitely a similar number of people would have died. I think the big misconception about Trotsky is that, well, Trotsky wanted this like international revolution and stuff like that, where Stalin wanted to focus on domestic heavy industry and everything. Stalin got the 5-year plan idea shit from Trotsky, but he was better at playing politics. But Trotsky, he wasn't like some, feeble, he can't win a power struggle. He had a chance. He was obviously the head of the Red Army. He butchered like 5 million people for Lenin. That man definitely, I mean, Trotsky, I know that there are a lot of Marxists out there that will try to like sanitize Trotsky and say, oh, things would have been better. It's like, well, if Trotsky was in charge, you would have had a very similar industrial policy. You would have had forced collectivization as well. You would have had decolonization as well. You would have had the purges. You would have had the gulags. You would have had all the just the absolute calamity that befell the Soviet Union. The one difference probably would have been that the Soviet Union might have been slightly more reluctant to enter into the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact than Stalin was. But what I will say on that, though, is that I think that at the end of the day, Trotsky probably he might have actually posed a bigger menace than Stalin. I mean, there was. I mean, at what point did they kill the same number of people? It was like what? It was like 5 or 6 years into Stalin's rule. I mean, because Trotsky started off with like 5 million dead during the Civil War that he was responsible for. So this idea that like neocons come from Trotskyism or whatever. Irving Kristol basically thought of it as like a big meme and a joke, and he said that he reflected on those times as like, well, it's a good way to like debate over technicalities with other people and stuff and have a more nuanced view. But he really came to see America as like the vanguard of liberty and everything, and became a really staunch anti-communist. I mean, the neoconservative movement, contrary to I guess popular belief, actually went on to be the center of a proactive anti-communist movement in America. I mean, you can talk about the John Birch Society and stuff like that, but no, the neocons actually, even more so than the John Birch people, the neocons really brought about the downfall of the Soviet Union. So, and of course, modern neoconservatives, we're talking people like, Bill Kristol, Irving Kristol's son, and his associates, all, pretty right-wing, capitalist, democratic, pro-U.S. hegemony, American exceptionalists, and pro-Israel. And usually some of them will either be secular, some of them will be like evangelical, very anti-communist across the board, though. So that's what I hope will serve to debunk the memes around neoconservatism that way. The last point that I would say on that is that the one thing about the intellectual roots of starting off in the den of the devil in that sense is that you really do see with your own eyes just how evil the Trotskyites and stuff were, and just how evil the radical left was in that sense. It's like not Bill Kristol, Ben Shapiro can never really know that. Like, he can read about how bad communism and stuff was, but it's like to actually go into those circles and stuff and actually see the dogma, to see the ambition, to see the agenda firsthand. I think seeing that firsthand, being in the belly of the beast and coming out of it, I think that served to make the neocons so anti-communist in their later years, because they knew what the agenda that they were up against from the communist side. So that's my view there. So
okay. Yeah, like I said, I'm just going to repeat myself here, but this was a lovely conversation that we had. I'll probably do something similar to you and just kind of give my thoughts about. I'm pretty much probably going to repeat what I say here, but I'll just do a short little video about that. And
same here. I'm doing a post show later on, and all I'm going to say in the post show is just kind of go over. Isn't that wild? A neocon and an Nazbol had a debate, and it wasn't complete total blood sports. You know, Henry didn't interject once. So the last thing that I'd say about Trotsky, though, the last thing is that people will say, well, wasn't Trotsky against Stalin, and wasn't Trotsky against the Soviet Union and everything? He was jealous he lost the power struggle. That's the only difference. If he had become the dictator, I guarantee you Stalin would have had a permanent revolution and all that bullshit. So, that's how this goes. He was upset that he lost. He was a sore loser. So
yeah, I can agree with that point. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Really, there was something else popping in my head. I can't think of it offhand, but I guess I will just suggest to you, sir. But once you get some debates under your belt, you should try to go for Vosh. I know that you talked about that.
No. Vosh is the goal. I actually want to. No. I've talked about this on the show before. I actually want to go after Vosh, and the thing is, I like Vosh in the sense that I feel like he and we'd have a good time, and I feel like he and I could have a beer together and stuff. I actually, in some ways, feel that I could hawk pill him, and likewise, I actually think that Jesse Lee Peterson and I would also have a good time, and that I could probably kind of hawk pill him too. But here's the thing about Vosh. Big hot take here, perhaps. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Caleb Maupin earlier in this debate tonight. Yep. You probably regard Caleb Maupin as winning that debate, right, with Vosh?
Somewhat. I don't think he was that strong necessarily.
Okay. I thought he won. I thought he unequivocally won. So, So because he said to Vosh, he's like, you can't just dissociate yourself from history. That's insane. Because if you're going to call yourself a socialist, you have to take the successes and the failures of socialism. It's like for me, like if I'm going to call myself a neocon, I can't exactly say, oh, well, I'm not like in support of the Iraq War or anything. It's like, no, you have to own it. It's like, whereas with Vosh, he's like, oh, I'm a socialist, I'm a communist and all this, but like, you can't ascribe the Soviets or China and all this stuff. They're just fascists. He basically calls everybody that disagrees with them right wing, which is funny because for me, I don't call Nick Fuentes left wing per se. I don't call Patrick Buchanan left wing just because I disagree with them. I'm willing to recognize that there are people on the right that I don't agree with. Whereas for Vosh, he can't do it. He's like, no, everybody, if you agreed with me, you'd be left. That's so childish. And so if I debate Vosh, here's what I'm going to say to Vosh, which is that you call yourself anti-tanky, but you say that Castro's different. How is Castro different? He didn't have the same number of people to kill. Like nobody's ever called him out on that. I don't get it. I mean, he says, "Oh, Castro's different." It's like, no, he's a tanky who has, I guess, he's a bit more of a squeamish tanky in terms of the kill count that he'll tolerate. But he's tolerating of Castro, so spare me the anti-tanky stuff. But
yeah, definitely, I can agree with that, and I wish you the best of luck with that. Hopefully, when that comes up.
I'll watch your debate with Vosh too. I'll say that. I'll watch your debate with Vosh.
Well, the thing is, I've already had a run-in with Vosh. The thing is, I was just trolling. Yeah, I was trolling him because I had a book on. Sometimes I read some stuff for like Nation of Islam because a lot of it's just funny to read some of this Nation of Islam stuff about like Elijah Muhammad and whatnot, saying that Yaqub created white people. Anyway, I had a book about Marcus Garvey, and I was just trolling him a little bit. It was like just for a couple of minutes, and he finished with what were you, Italian or something like that? And he's like, oh, and I joked, I was playing with him. I was like, yeah, I'm Italian. Oh, of course, you're black. And then of course he hung up. He kicked me off the Discord. But that's what it was. I just wanted to troll him for a minute. It wasn't worth me trying to find. I forget. It was like 3 or 4 months ago now. But yeah.
No, I think Vosh will definitely want to debate me at some point. I mean, I have a policy where I only do debates on my channel, so he probably won't actually do a debate with me until I've got a few 100,000 subscribers, which is probably about 5 years off from now. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm doing 2 videos a day every day minimum until we hit the $500 mark on Patreon. Then we'll do 3 videos a day and so on and so forth. So there we go.
I respect the hustle.
Yeah. But well, I'll say, again, pretty cordial conversation. I'm just looking at the chat for once now. People saying it got heated in the chat. So the chat might have been a shit show, but this debate was actually cordial. So
yeah, and I tried several times to be like, I will say this. I did try to say several times, don't try to troll folks, this and that. I wasn't sure who was going to be in here, so I don't know if Reese was going to be here, and I see that Net7's the only one that was here, so I was like, I did try to say them by name. Just be careful about who you say, this and that. I did try to say that, but I can't. Like I say, people are people at the end of the day, so they have their beliefs, this and that. Overall, I usually just let my chat argue amongst themselves, which may not be the best thing, but it's kind of like organized chaos. I let them say what they will, and then, but yeah.
No, absolutely. So, I don't even check the chat during the debates. If I have the time, I'll read the chat later on. Usually don't. These days, 2 videos a day, I don't really have the time to read the chat that much. I don't even get to all my comments. So,
absolutely not. Yeah.
But that's the thing. So, what I will say though is, I'd be interested in having another debate down the road. We've got 3 more debates lined up this week, so it'll be a little while. But there are a lot of areas that a neocon and a Nazbol could find to disagree on to debate over. So,
absolutely. Oh yeah. This is my last point, and then we'll go ahead and call it good. Is I'm sure that people will say, well, he's not actually a Nazbol. He's probably more of a, just a garden variety right winger or something like that. So apologies if you probably get that. They'll be like, hey, he's not really, just because he mentioned Carl Otto Pytel doesn't mean he's actually. And I'm sure that's going to come up. Is he really this? Is he, so anyways, but yeah. We'll see how that goes. Yeah. But anyway, thank you very much for this conversation. I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, no, it was a good conversation. Well, you have a good night, Uncle Thomas.
You too.
Yep. I will be streaming in probably about 10 minutes to do the post-game analysis if you guys want to tune in here. Otherwise, Thomas is doing one over on his channel pretty soon. You can go and check that out as well. Or you can watch them both at a later date, right? So that's about everything that I got. So I think it was a good debate. Henry did a good job, and we didn't actually really need any moderation at any point, so that was good. So
yeah, absolutely.
Well, have a good night. We're gonna
you too.
Peace.
Bye bye.